Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Gladiator in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 1, Introduction 1. Little do we think of how fortuitous the circumstances were during the times of Avatar Aang. Not often do we realize everything could have turned out very differently had only one factor been removed. The removal of said factor would allow for endless possibilities to unveil themselves. For what would have happened if Katara hadn't tagged along on that fishing trip with her brother Sokka? What if she had decided to stay behind to help her grandmother with her chores? The changes on the story that was already written would be unimaginable. The world as we came to know it wouldn't exist. To picture such developments may be unfathomable, but who is to say it wasn't likely? Who is to declare it was impossible? Certainly, the story as we know it wouldn't have been written, but a different story would have been born instead. A story where the struggle to save the world is not in the manner we envisioned, where a different war wages in the form of fighters who strive to prove their worth through their bending or their weapons. A tale where the least expected love story unfolds, changing the way a princess sees the world, changing the way a young man makes a name for himself when he takes upon the challenge of becoming Gladiator. Staring into the white horizon anxiously had become, to Katara's utter displeasure, her most recurrent activity nowadays. She had started doing it when her brother had decided to join the war in hopes to force the Fire Nation out of their home. He had left the tribe a week ago, and she couldn't even bother practicing her waterbending forms because of how concerned she was over his fate. Ever since she was a kid she had grown used to this way of life, sitting by the edge of the village, waiting for the warriors to return, and returned they had, most of them. But by now, hardly any warriors from the Southern Water Tribe were involved in the war, for there wasn't much of a war to be fought anymore. With their skills enhanced by the power of Sozin's comet, the Firebenders had taken over the world much faster than anyone anticipated. The Earth Kingdom had collapsed when the overpowered Firebenders had taken over Ba Sing Se and most of the major Earth Kingdom towns. Not even Kyoshi Island had gotten away from the slaughter. The balance between the four nations was little more than a myth at this point in time, and not even Katara could hold on to the hope of the Avatar returning anymore. She had to face reality. The Fire Nation had won the war, and the one thing the Southern Water Tribe could do was attempt to stand their ground for as long as possible before the Fire Nation came for them, too. Not many firebenders could endure the cold environment of the poles. They were far more comfortable in the warmth of tropical regions, where the sun would shine brightly nearly every day, providing them with the strength they needed to burn down everything in their way. The poles' dynamics were very difficult for them to bear, since the sun would shine during 6 months, but it would be absent for the rest of the year, weakening any firebender greatly. The light period was about to end in the South Pole, but the 6 months of sunlight hadn't gone without a hitch. While they'd had the upper hand on the Northern Water Tribe after over 5 years of fighting, the Fire Nation's forces had split, and part of their navy had moved down to the south. After a few battles against the natives, they had taken over a small territory of the icy tundra, marking it as their land and instating a large, metal building to prove their might. However, only a handful of guards would stand by this newly obtained territory, due to how difficult it was for Fire Nation soldiers to survive in this environment. Taking advantage of this fact, Sokka and the best warriors of the Southern Water Tribe were getting ready to attack the Fire Nation settlement. He had taken his most reliable supporters with him, the kids he had trained in the art of fighting ever since he was scarcely a teenager himself. They had grown to admire him and follow his every command over time. Currently they were on a scouting mission, or so Sokka had claimed, to obtain more information regarding the Fire Nation's new base. Hakata, the tribe's chieftain and Sokka's father, hadn't approved of those plans, but Sokka was a daring young man, 21 winters old, determined to fight back against the Fire Nation's advances in whichever way he could. Thus, Katara was left to await her brother's return by the edge of the village, hoping he would be back before the darker half of the year began. It was already quite hard to face the coldest temperatures while inside the village, and the weather during the dark period, outside the walls of the Southern Water Tribe, could prove deadly. Katara shook her head, trying to shun such gloomy thoughts from her mind, but she was unable to do so. She could never contain her concern for her brother when he left for too long. "Dinner is ready, Katara," said an elderly woman, who had silently joined her granddaughter outside the village a short moment ago. The girl turned and smiled kindly at Kunna. "Thanks, Gran," she muttered. I'll go in a bit, I'm just waiting. Katara, it will be better if you come inside, said Kunna. You need to rest properly. The dark period is coming, it won't do you good to spend so much time out in the cold. For that matter, you're the last one who should tell me that, said Katara, turning to her elderly grandmother. Let's both go inside, Gran. Kunna smiled and headed inside the village again. Katara followed suit, but she turned around for one last glimpse of the horizon. She could only hope to see a shadowy figure far away, walking towards her, clad in his warrior outfit, waving at her. She smiled sadly as she saw a humanoid shape far away, for she was certain her mind was playing tricks on her. She had seen Sokka return like that so many times that she was already seeing things, only, she was actually seeing something now. She rubbed her eyes with her gloved hands, and the shape was still there. Sokka! She called, surprising Kunna, who had thought her granddaughter was right behind her. More shapes appeared in the far horizon, all of them clad in the typical blue armor of Water Tribe warriors. The one leading all of them was beaming and waving, his carefree attitude giving away his identity with ease. Sokka! Yelled Katara, smiling and sprinting towards him. She swung her arms around his neck and embraced her brother once she reached him. Sokka chuckled and hugged her too, surprised by how much she had missed him only after a week of being apart. I'm back, Katara, he said, and she smiled as she pulled away from him. I was so worried. You guys took too long to come back this time. She exclaimed, scolding her older brother, as ever. Sokka grinned guiltily at her accusations. The other warriors walked by them as Sokka patted his sister on the top of her head, and they were amused to watch their fearsome leader being treated like a little kid. I know, Katara, I know, and I'm sorry about that. But you'll see we were worth the wait. He said, smiling widely. We've got some great information this time, you'll be amazed when you hear it. We'll finally have a chance to kick those Fire Nation invaders out and send them back to that slice of hell they belong in. Katara stared at him with concern again, uneasy about her brother's ploys to beat the Fire Nation. She hated everything about the invaders, she always had, but life in the tribe had been calm these last few days, and she didn't wish for the small peace they had achieved to be broken in any way. Whatever plan Sokka was devising to tear apart the Fire Nation settlement on the South Pole promised to disrupt said peace, and it might destroy it altogether. Are you sure about this, Sokka? Asked Katara, but he ignored her question as he walked to greet his grandmother. Hey, Gran. He called her, and Kunna grinned, hugging him tightly. We were worried sick about you, Sokka, said Kunna. Don't leave for so long again, I beg you. I won't leave for a whole week again, I promise, he told her. But I do have to take off again in a few days. Things are looking up. What exactly do you mean by that, Sokka? Asked Katara, frowning and seizing his attention this time. I think I'll explain everything over dinner, he stated, smiling clumsily. I'm starving. Katara sighed in defeat as the three of them entered the village amongst the other warriors, who headed into their houses and greeted their respective families. Katara smiled as she heard the cries of joy and laughter in each hut. The only good part about the war was that it helped everyone value their family members far more than they would under normal circumstances. Although, to be quite honest, it wasn't as if she knew much about what normal circumstances were like, she had never known a world without war. Sokka headed inside the largest igloo in town, the one that belonged to Chief Hakeda's family. Hakeda had served the Water Tribe's warriors for many years now, but a few months after the Fire Nation had taken over the Earth Kingdom, he had decided, after losing some of the best fighters of the tribe, that it would be safer for what was left of their battalion to return home. His wise decision had saved many lives, but at the same time, their withdrawal from the war had been as surrendering the world to the Fire Nation. At first Hakeda had been determined to make sure the Water Tribe wouldn't undergo the same fate as the Earth Kingdom and the Air Nomads had, but his age was starting to weigh on him. He was tired after investing half his life battling in a war he couldn't win. His son's enthusiasm wasn't contagious for Hakeda, in fact, it discouraged him instead. He had already lost a wife because of the war, and he would hate to lose his son as well. Relief washed over Hakeda when Sokka appeared at the igloo's threshold, setting his weapons down and grinning at him cheerfully. I'm back, Dad, he said, as he embraced his father. And I have great news. Hakata patted his son on the back before pulling away, smiling also. The best news you could give me, you already have. You are safe and sound, Sokka, and that is what matters most. And I would like to have dinner before you fill my mind with plots to destroy the Fire Nation, if you don't mind. Sokka sighed and rolled his eyes, but he smiled at his father and nodded in agreement. As they ate, even though Katara was quite certain it wasn't wise of him to do so, Sokka presented his family with the tale of his trip. After explaining how some of the warriors had infiltrated the settlement, disguised as Fire Nation guards, he finally reached the main event, the great revelation that he believed would tip the scales to their favor. It wasn't easy, but once I had my disguise so they wouldn't notice I was Water Tribe, I walked into the main building and pretended to stand guard during a small meeting, he explained, lifting his empty dish and requesting another serving of noodles. Katara complied with his wishes, bending some of the soup into his bowl. And I heard the best news I could have asked for. There will be a bigger meeting in the settlement in 2 days, several big shots from the Fire Nation will attend it, and they'll be discussing how to take over the whole pole. Apparently, they're striving to do it during the dark period, even when they know they'll be weakened. They're bound to bring in lots of benders to help keep guard of their station, but the cold is a great disadvantage for them, it weakens them while it gives us cover. If we surround the perimeter once the meeting is taking place, we can take out the guards and make the big leaders our prisoners. Who are these people who'll attend the meeting? Asked Hakata, frowning. Did you hear anything specific about them? Not really, said Sokka, shrugging. I heard that the governor they plan to impose on us will come, and who knows what other crazy Fire Nation military people. They won't be easy to outsmart, Sokka, said Hakata, crossing his arms over his chest. And even if the sun is gone during the dark period, they won't be completely powerless. Ever the party pooper, said Sokka, sighing. Dad, I know you're worried and you don't want me involved in anything this dangerous, but I can handle this operation. There's hardly any way for this plan to fail. We know the layout of their settlement really well thanks to this scouting mission, and we'll have the element of surprise on our side, since they have no idea we've got this information. I can devise a strategy so we can take over the whole. Sokka, do you realize what's at stake here? Asked Hakata, staring at his son sternly. Sokka was the one to frown now, and he glared at his father as he muttered, between gritted teeth. Stop treating me like a child. I know what I'm doing. Do you, really? Asked Hakata. You're being selfish and naive, Sokka. You might be a great leader, but by pulling through with this plan, you wouldn't only put your own neck in the line, but everyone else's as well. You could just as easily get them killed by dragging them to the Fire Lord's palace. You think I'm going to let my men die? Asked Sokka, snorting in disbelief. What I think is that you don't understand that your men can die. Exclaimed Hakata. Are you ready to face the consequences of losing your fellow warriors? Can you tell those families that their beloved husband, father, brother, or uncle died fighting for you? It won't happen, growled Sokka, stubbornly. I have a good plan, and you'll see nobody on our side will die because of it. Does that mean you're planning on killing Fire Nation people? Muttered Kunna. How will that make you better than them, then? Sokka was aghast by those words, and he looked from his grandmother to his father, feeling betrayed. So you just want me to sit here with the rest of you, knitting and fishing for whatever's left of my life until the Fire Nation comes to slaughter our village? You think that's what I should do? You don't want to regain the territories that are rightfully ours, the territories they took from us? The warriors that died to keep the village safe would be disgusted to see us given to the Fire Nation like this. Bato would never accept this. He would have fought to the end. Don't you dare pretend to understand Bato, growled Hakata. He was nothing like either one of us, he knew what was at stake in this war far better than I did, and it was my own foolishness what brought him to his death. I thought myself undefeatable, much like you do, and I wasn't the one to pay the price for my arrogance. It would have been better if I'd been the one to. Don't say that, Dad, muttered Katara, looking at Hakata apprehensively. Please, can we all just calm down and talk this through? I'm trying to talk this through, grunted Sokka. But it seems the man I always looked up to isn't as brave as I used to think he was. Heikata knew his son was being so defiant because he wished to prove he was as capable a leader as Heikata once had been, but Heikata had already lost too many people he had loved dearly to even imagine losing Sokka because of the boy's own arrogance. "Sokka, just listen to me," he muttered. "If you wish to go, I cannot stop you. But this is by far the riskiest move you've ever made, and I won't let you go until you really understand all you're risking with your scheme." "Believe it or not, you don't need to explain anything to me," Sokka retorted. "I know what's at stake in wars. I won't fail to bring everyone back home, you can count on it." Heikata sighed and shook his head, for his son refused to listen to reason. At this rate he would only ever learn the lesson the hard way. Heikata didn't want things to develop like this, but it was bound to happen if Sokka kept acting so recklessly. The world wasn't merciful to the men who believed they were strong enough to face every obstacle head first. Heikata had come upon this knowledge in the worst possible way after losing his best friend to the Fire Nation on an unsuccessful raid to an enemy campsite. He had been certain his plans wouldn't fail, since they hardly ever did, but he was proven wrong when almost half his men had been slain that day. This terrible defeat had brought him to decide to return to the South Pole to protect his people. All the hope he had held in his heart long ago had vanished slowly over time, and despite how much he loathed to think like this, he had accepted that the Fire Nation had won. The only area still relatively free from their armies and firebenders was the South Pole, and at this rate, they wouldn't last long either. At times he wondered if they should simply surrender. At least they might survive if they did. But Sokka's headstrong nature wouldn't allow him to give up. He had been born and raised under the firm belief that the Fire Nation's deeds were completely wrong. As the idealistic young man he was, he had no qualms over putting his life in the line to battle against the people who had taken his mother from him, the people who had destroyed 2 other cultures in the most gruesome manner possible. Sokka was set in his ways. He would defend his tribe, and he would defeat the Fire Nation. He was certain he would be perfectly suited for the task someday, if only he was given a chance to lead his warriors to the war's front lines, but his father wouldn't allow him to do that, not right now. Yet Heikata would have no reason to refuse Sokka's request to join the war once he had succeeded with the mission he had only just explained to him. And Sokka would succeed. Everything was in place for him to do so. Katara looked from one man to the other, her eyes filled with concern. Her family had already suffered many losses, but they had always gotten along despite the upsetting circumstances. Something within her chest seemed to stir and weigh her down, for a sense of loss had taken over her even before anything troublesome had occurred. Because, if Sokka accomplished his goals, their father still wouldn't approve of Sokka's actions. And if her father was right to say Sokka would fail, Katara didn't even want to think of the consequences of that. Sokka wouldn't be able to stand losing his friends, and if it came to the worst-case scenario she could picture, she would be the one completely devastated if her brother were the one to perish in what promised to be a horrible battle. As it was, she could only trust Sokka's instincts, no matter how many times they had been wrong so far. Maybe there wouldn't be anyone particularly dangerous within the Fire Nation's big shots he meant to capture, and the soldiers would attain victory without any losses, just as Sokka planned. Maybe there was nothing worth worrying about at all. Sokka could lead his warriors, she knew he could, and she believed in him. Because all she could do for him at this point was hope for the best. All she could do was hope nothing deadly awaited her brother within the Fire Nation's settlement. A frown spread over the princess's brow as she tapped the edge of her throne's armrest impatiently. Usually, she would be comfortable with traveling by ship, especially while traveling in one as magnificent as her personally selected vessel, but the decreasing temperature only increased her unease with every mile they traveled. But she didn't blame her discomfort on the weather. At least, not completely. She knew what the true source of her displeasure was, she had known it for years now. In fact, she had known what it was for her entire life. She was pondering the matter that irritated her when the captain of her royal barge walked up to her and bowed before giving her the report of their situation. "We are approaching the bay, my lord Ash." "Princess." The glare she presented him with was so harsh that the man froze in place briefly, and it had nothing to do with the cold. She could easily read in his terrified features that he would much rather be tossed into the freezing water than face her wrath. He stumbled back, dreading the consequences of enraging the young woman. Yet Azula merely brought her hands together, intertwining her fingers and resting against the back of her chair as she continued to glower at him. "Good. Do make sure we reach the settlement smoothly, will you?" she said, a venomous tinge coating her every word. "Yes, Princess," he said, performing a very deep bow before running off as quickly as he could to the engine room of the ship. He had departed so swiftly, not because his presence would be required below, but because he wished to be as far from the deadly lady as he could be within the ship. Angela sighed once he was gone and she shook her head in complete disgust. She was a powerful woman in a world ruled by weak men who seemed to believe that only men should hold privileged positions. During her childhood days she had been seen as inferior to her brother, not because she was the younger sibling, but because she was a girl. It didn't matter if she was a far more powerful firebender, a greater strategist or a better leader. The nobleman wouldn't care less about her qualities unless she somehow woke up one day transfigured into a man. The sole idea made her shiver in disgust. She had grown to hate the sexist society she lived within, and she most definitely wouldn't want to become another one of the males she had grown to despise. She only ever felt prized and cared for by her father, and he was the only example of a gentleman she had met so far. The rest of the men she knew, they really weren't worth thinking about. So she definitely didn't want a spirit of some sort to turn her into a man. She wanted to prove her worth as a woman. She wished to show the world that gender made no difference when it came to actual talent in politics or bending, and if it made any difference, then said difference probably served to prove that she was superior to all the men she knew. She wasn't weak, she wasn't fragile-minded, and she most definitely wouldn't be content with a simple life based on social interaction in parties and balls, like the other women she knew. She wanted more, and she deserved more. She was the heir to the Fire Nation's throne, and once she obtained the crown, she would make sure all the disdaining of the females would vanish completely. She could become the most amazing leader her nation had ever witnessed, and she knew she would. It was only a matter of time. But was it? For all she knew, what the nobleman hoped for could come true one day, and she might lose her claim to the throne. For all she knew, Zuko might find the Avatar and return home, regaining the honor that he had been denied. The sole thought made her cringe. It wasn't so much her dislike for her brother, which was evident and mutual, as it was her wishes to retain her current privileged position. By now, she had almost spent 9 years putting up with the pressures of being her father's heir and being a girl at the same time. And despite she was certain she had excelled at her role so far, by both terrifying and inspiring respect from her subjects, she knew that whenever she turned around they began whispering about how inappropriate it was for a woman to hold such an honorable position. And she wasn't making this up out of paranoia. Once, after a war meeting had ended, she had left the hall but returned shortly in hopes to convey one final thought to her former most admired military figure, Admiral Zhao. But before entering the hall she had overheard him, and several other generals who had been present at the meeting, chuckling at her expenses, claiming a 13-year-old girl, her age at the time, was better off playing with dolls than getting involved in military tactics and strategies. They were convinced that she would never understand the true extent of what they discussed in the meetings because she was a woman. A woman. And what was so wrong with that? She never understood why there was such a barrier between males and females. Sure, the differences between both genders were completely clear, but what made one better than the other? Who had decided which one was better? She truly wished to discover the answer to the second question for the sole purpose of electrifying the culprit to prove him wrong. But would such display of power and greatness help her cause? Probably not. She could have taken over Ba Sing Se on her own and they still would consider her inferior to them. She gritted her teeth and looked forward, trying to keep those unsettling thoughts off her mind. She was heading down to the South Pole's settlement as her father's representative, to ascertain they would take over the Water Tribe as soon as possible. Circumstances were against them now, since they would be battling over the ownership of the pole during a dark period. The absence of the sun wouldn't fail to cut to half the power of even the greatest firebenders. But they had an advantage: all the waterbenders of the Southern Water Tribe had been slain years ago. According to the reports, there wasn't a single one left. So if their soldiers were to face any hardships, they would come solely from warriors, which were still dangerous, but not as deadly as waterbenders attacking them when they were at their weakest. She was attending the meeting in a diplomatic manner, but she was certain she could provide valuable input to their strategies to defeat the Water Tribe warriors, well, that is, if she wasn't the one to develop all the plans altogether. She could already imagine the way the meeting would proceed, with those admirals and generals discussing and arguing out of the pathetic need to show who was the more dominant one, to prove who was the manliest man, and then she'd give out a brilliant strategy, a perfect plan not only to protect the settlement, but to take over the enemy village during this period. Angela wanted to devise a plan that wouldn't even require reinforcements. The Fire Nation armies were spread out thin all over the world, and their best firebenders would be battling in the Northern Water Tribe, since the light period would begin there soon and they would finally gain the upper hand. The North Pole was, of course, a bigger threat than the South Pole, since there were still many powerful waterbenders there. Hence, they would need as many soldiers as possible in order to submit the massive tribe to the will of the Fire Nation, and they only had half a year to fulfill said purpose. Therefore, she would make sure to keep the scales tipped to their favor by conquering the Southern Water Tribe without asking for any help from those who were currently fighting up north. She had that much confidence in her skills as a strategist. She knew it would be no easy feat for the Fire Nation forces to triumph in the south. The cold even made her shiver, despite she kept breathing deeply and increasing her body heat at will, and she was one of the greatest firebenders alive, second only to her father. Surely the small battalion that they'd brought for this siege would have a hard time fighting in these conditions, but she was convinced they could succeed. She was already thinking about her plans, and she was certain she'd find a way for the Fire Nation to stand its ground against the savages down in the pole, but it all depended on the men, as usual. Unless they suddenly grew a spine and admitted she understood the wages of war far better than they did, they would dismiss her every intervention by claiming this was no place for a princess. She knew it would take a lot of effort to bring them to trust and acknowledge her, but she was determined to forge a name for herself, to prove she was far above the challenges they were unwilling to impose on her. Because she was the daughter of the Fire Lord, and the heir to the throne. And she wouldn't surrender, not to the men of the Fire Nation or to the Water Tribe savages. It wasn't a matter of fighting to the end, of winning, or dying in the process. There was no such option. She would conquer and burn to the ground whoever dared oppose her, just like her father had done when he'd had Sozin's comet to fuel his strength a few years ago. She wouldn't waver, because she was Princess Angela, and nobody could stand in her way without facing dire consequences for it. She didn't know it at the moment, but she would be teaching this lesson to the men around her sooner than she thought, at the expenses of a Water Tribe savage who would jump headfirst into battle, not knowing whom he would be dealing with. Chapter 2, Introduction 2. The ship anchored on the shore, or what Angela assumed could be considered a shore, next to the handful of vessels owned by the men who were meant to attend today's meeting. Angela stood up from her throne-like seat and readied herself to disembark. The barge's crew stood on the deck, and they bowed down as Angela strode past them, glaring at the icy tundra that spread before her. It came as no surprise that there would be no committee to welcome and escort her all the way to the settlement that stood a few yards away. Angela sighed, certain that the men that waited for her within the building were the scumbags she was used to dealing with. If her father was nearby, they would treat her with phony respect. But if he wasn't, they would ignore her and hope she learned she had no place in war meetings, especially in war meetings in the South Pole. But Angela hardly cared for what they thought of her. She would make her own path in the world through her own means, not through whatever opinion others had of her. With steady footing, she walked down the ramp that led her to the frozen ground, and she flared her inner fire to ensure she wouldn't falter due to the unfavorable conditions to her organism. The two royal guards that followed her weren't as skilled at controlling their own temperature, though. The cold caused them to lag behind, for their fire-bending potential was nowhere close to that of the princess they had been tasked to protect, and their very bones seemed to be about to freeze in this weather. To Angela's disapproval, she found, as she glanced at the settlement, that there weren't enough sentries to provide an adequate protection of the territory they had acquired. For all they knew, there could be savages lurking behind those icy mounds that stood not too far from the building, and, as it was, the settlement lacked a proper defense to fight them off. The carelessness of whoever was in charge of this station could easily cost them their one advantage over the Southern Water Tribe. Angela frowned as she approached the metallic gates of the structure, which were wide open, for they had been expecting her arrival. The two guards standing next to the gates bowed in her direction and Angela didn't bother acknowledging them, even though their actions pleased her. At least these men knew how to show some respect. She entered the main building of the settlement after walking through the snowy enclosure as quickly as she could, trying to ignore how the inside of the metallic structure seemed to be even colder than it was outside. Despite her fast strides, Angela hoped she was delaying them. Making a grand entrance after they were all assembled would draw a lot of attention to her, and luckily, if they studied her carefully enough, they would realize she wasn't in the mood to tolerate their sexist attitude, not now, not ever. And with said determination flaring in her eyes, she waited for her royal guards to open the door of the largest room in the building. She entered it with her head held up high, quickly identifying the 6 men within the room before they could even turn to greet her. The group of men sat around a table, several files and documents were spread over it. One of them held a smoke to his mouth, the smell of which disgusted Angela, but the stench was familiar enough for her to recognize him as Admiral Chan, the man meant to govern over the South Pole as soon as the region had been conquered. The man carried his cigarettes with him anywhere he went, a trait that some people took as a fitting addiction for a firebender, but Angela thought differently. The best firebenders needed great lung capacity, since breath was essential for the art of bending fire. Smoking was the best way to deteriorate your skills as a firebender, or so Angela believed, and so far, she hadn't been proven wrong. She had known Admiral Chan for years, and she could ascertain his fighting abilities had dulled over time. To his right sat Commander Tsang, a recently promoted man in his 30s whose arrogance was larger than whatever skill had landed him his boost in the Fire Nation's army. Captain Tao, the man of lowest rank amongst them all, sat on the other side of Chan, looking extremely nervous and even more so now that the princess had walked inside the room. General Bujing was also there, the man to whom Angela's older brother had spoken out of turn in a war meeting a long time ago, and he seemed close to falling asleep out of boredom. Commander Gon immediately jumped when the door opened, for the man was always on the brink of a nervous breakdown, a mannerism for which Angela disliked him deeply. The last man in the room was General Mac, another recent addition to the highest ranks of the army, but Mac was far more focused on doing his job than bragging about it, unlike Tsang. Just as she had expected it, Angela wasn't comfortable at all amongst these men. Her stern facade didn't acquire any emotion whatsoever when Tao, Bujing, and Mac stood up courteously, to her distaste. "Princess, we weren't briefed you had arrived," said Bujing, smiling. "It would seem you weren't," she muttered, each word she uttered coated with disdain towards the men she was facing. "I don't believe my father will be pleased to hear of your impolite behavior. To leave a woman walk down this icy territory by herself speaks very ill of your manners." "Oh, please do excuse us, Your Majesty," said Bujing, the most charismatic of them all. "As I said, we had no notice of your arrival. We were certain you would come by later." "Later? You believe I'm not punctual?" she asked, toying with the man's mind and pulling him out of his comfort zone by questioning his every word. "Of course not, Princess. I wouldn't dream of. Let's address the matter of your disrespectful attitude after the meeting is through, shall we?" said Angela, walking to the empty chair that waited for her across Admiral Chan. "We should get this over with." "Indeed," stated Chan, who hadn't bothered acknowledging her presence until now. And as the meeting began, trouble stirred outside the settlement. Behind the mounds of snow that had caught Angela's eye as she headed towards her destination, a group of men clad in water tribe armors awaited the orders of their commanding officer, who kept glancing at the metallic settlement, analyzing it from afar. "Okay. Listen up, everyone," said Sokka, turning around and facing his men once again. "We have to take over the settlement itself first. It should prove really easy, there aren't many guards around, and their powers must have already weakened since the dark period began yesterday. The same must have happened to the people inside the settlement, and also to whoever was left taking care of the ships." "There's a huge one right there," said a teenager, Katon, pointing at the royal barge that stood out over the other 4 vessels. "Do you really think we can take these guys? If we get our hostages, it won't be as hard as you think," said Sokka, smiling. "All right, then, the plan is very simple. We have to take out the guards on the walls, which is hardly a matter of concern. We've done that before without a hitch. All we have to do is be very stealthy about it and it'll go perfectly fine. They could ring an alarm if we're spotted, but maybe they haven't installed one yet. So it's possible the hostages won't know their meeting is getting hijacked until it's too late for them to do anything about it. I'll be the only one to jump into the meeting room, the rest of you should take out all the firebenders. 2-on-1 should do the trick, they'll hardly know what to do if you attack like this. Sokka interrupted another of his warriors, Haka. Are you sure about this? I mean, things might turn out far worse than you think they will. What will we do if the people left in the ships attack us, or if there are more guards inside the settlement than you expect? We'll take them out, stated Sokka, curtly. They're pretty much powerless at this point, and if they're mostly benders, we'll have the upper hand. Once the guards by the wall are done for, we'll jump inside the enclosure and beat up any other Fire Nation soldiers that might be inside. As I said, I'll be the one heading into the meeting and I'll secure the hostages quickly. How? Asked Haka. Sokka pulled out a small gray sphere from his pocket and he showed it to the group. It's a smoke bomb I designed myself, he said, smirking at his creation. I'll toss it inside the room where the meeting is taking place, and in the turmoil, I'll secure the hostages one by one. Will you really do this on your own? Asked a boy that admired him deeply, Euro. That's madness, Sokka. Well, I don't really need to go alone, but it'll be dangerous, getting involved with Fire Nation big shots. So I think your leader is the one who should do that. He said, smiling. And what if something goes wrong? Asked Katon, again. Sokka sighed and folded his arms as he looked at his men with disbelief. You guys are worse than my father, you know. He grunted. Okay, we'll have a signal just in case we need to break off the operation at some point. If the people from the ships realize there's something wrong and come after us, you guys should roar like polar bear dogs, suggested Euro. Yeah, that should work, said Sokka. Do that if things look hopeless, okay? If you think the operation can still carry on, even if the guys from the ships attack us, then it will carry on. Now, if something happens to me, I'll do my best to toss this bomb. He showed them a red sphere this time and tucked it into a different pocket. It has red smoke in it. So if you see red smoke, you make a run for it. Just leave and make sure you don't turn back, okay? And what if you need help to get out of the settlement? Asked Euro. I don't know if I will, but if worse comes to worse, I'll make a run for it myself and tell you guys to flee as well by using the bomb. It's really not going to be so difficult if we take out the guards, guys, we can do this. Stop doubting yourselves so much. Who do you think will save this land other than ourselves? Pull it together. Let's get this operation going, and let's give those Fire Nation bastards what they deserve for underestimating us. His last words managed to encourage the group. The grimaces in the warriors' faces turned to smiles as they began arranging themselves in their respective positions to pull off the attack on the guards, behind the mounds of white snow that worked as their cover. They wouldn't have much time to take out all the sentries, but there were only about 10 firebenders and 30 warriors, and considering their opponents were far weaker than they usually were, it seemed the Water Tribe Regiment had the upper hand this time. They lurked in as close as they could without revealing themselves, still using the snow as cover. Katon, next to Sokka, muttered. We really could use a waterbender. We'd take out all those firebenders in a heartbeat and we could move the snow silently and use it as a cover for a little longer. Quit whining, replied Sokka. The only waterbender in the tribe is Katara and she won't get involved in these battles if I can avoid it. We can take them anyway. Katon sighed and nodded. Sokka looked around and caught the eye of his companions before nodding towards them, letting them know the operation was set to begin now. Sokka unsheathed the boomerang he carried so proudly on his broad back, and he threw it with brilliant aim straight at a guard's head. The weapon struck its target and the man instantly fell to the ground, knocked out by the blow. Sokka's boomerang soared for a few meters, but it didn't finish the trajectory back to his owner. Still, Sokka didn't fret. He would have a chance to pick up his favorite weapon shortly. 2 guards heard his fallen partner collapse, and when they turned to aid him and discover the source of his unconsciousness, Sokka lifted his club up in the air and led the charge towards the firebenders. The soldiers took notice of their enemies far too late to defend themselves effectively. Following Sokka's orders, 4 warriors headed to knock out the 2 sentinels on the very moment more guards spotted the group. To Sokka's pride, his men were very stealthy about their attacks and they managed to break through the feeble defenses of the Fire Nation. But just as Sokka and his men had dreaded, there was some movement in the ships that were anchored only a few yards away. They had been seen, and Sokka wasn't particularly surprised they had, but he still had enough time to secure his hostages before the reinforcements arrived. He picked up his boomerang and addressed his two most trusted warriors with a yell. "Katon, Haka. I need cover." And, holding steadily their shields and clubs, his two men obeyed him. The three sprinted towards the entrance of the settlement, in plain sight of the firebenders that stood guard on the upper wall of the structure. To Sokka's dismay, one of them was about to ring a bell to alert they were being attacked. Once again, he tossed his boomerang and its sharp edge struck the man on his neck. Blood spilled everywhere and the soldier collapsed a few meters before reaching the alarm bell. Sokka caught his boomerang on its trajectory back to him, and he swallowed hard when he saw the red liquid coating his weapon. He had just killed a man for the first time in his life. He shook his head upon that grim thought. He would have time to think of this deed later. He couldn't lose focus when he was in the middle of such an important operation. He wiped his boomerang clean with the loose snow on the ground, and he turned to his friends once more. "Take down every guard you see up on that wall. Keep them from reaching the bell. I'm going inside to secure the hostages," he exclaimed, patting his allies on the shoulder before sprinting off towards the building. Both Katon and Haka nodded at his command and used their own boomerangs to knock out two more guards that tried to approach the bell. The two warriors then climbed the settlement's wall to make sure nobody else would touch the bell. If the alarm rang, the hostages might find a way to escape, and they couldn't let that happen, not when the whole purpose of the operation was to take those Fire Nation men as prisoners. Sokka entered the inner building of the settlement, his mind completely set on what he had to do as he put on a mask to help him breathe and see once he unleashed his bomb. If there were firebenders inside, he would break their skulls with his club. He had no other choice but to do so. He was certain it wouldn't prove much of a challenge anyway, since any firebender that waited up ahead would be too weak to defend himself to begin with. Or so he believed. A few minutes before the attack commenced, Azula was fighting the urge to yawn as she watched Byujing and Chan arguing like fools, discussing which of the two had been responsible for the conquest of the city of Jialing. She couldn't believe she had to witness such a pathetic debate. "You claim you were so useful, but when you were facing against those earthbending students, your army was thwarted," yelled Chan. "It's not like you did any better by hiding amongst your men and waiting for them to do the job for you," said Byujing. "Did you expect me to be in the front lines, you idiot? I'm an admiral," he exclaimed. Azula felt a vein in her temple pulse as her eyebrows twitched. She couldn't take any more of this nonsense. "Gentlemen," she muttered, surprising the other four men, who had been close to falling asleep due to such fruitless conversation. "May I ask what exactly do you believe you'll accomplish by discussing your failures in Jialing?" Both Chan and Byujing stared at her in disbelief, insulted by her intervention. The remaining men couldn't suppress a smirk, although they also felt ashamed to see Azula was the only one with the guts to interrupt the useless discussion. "Failures? My dear princess, we did not fail in Jialing," grunted Byujing. "It may have taken months to take down the city, but we accomplished our goal eventually." Azula didn't bother masking a yawn this time, to both the arguing men's annoyance, and afterwards she tapped the edge of the table with her index finger. "Let's pretend you really did a good job by taking months to burn down a city that any competent leader would have crushed in half a week," she said, but before the other two replied, she asked, "What does that have to do with our current situation, if I may ask?" "We are debating to decide which one of us is most capable to lead the destruction of the Water Tribe," said Chan. "And judging by the fact that I'm meant to become the governor of this place, you should leave the job to me." "And what exactly is the course of action you're envisioning, Admiral Chan?" asked Azula, raising an inquisitive eyebrow. "How will you defeat the Water Tribe savages that defy our nation?" The Admiral was silenced immediately by Azula's words, and her piercing ember stare seemed to dig deep into his soul as she waited for his answer. Chan gulped, at a loss for words, and Azula sighed. "I figured as much," she muttered. "How about you, Byujing? Do you have anything useful in mind?" "I believe we should ensure the safety of the settlement first," he said, with certainty. "And take care of that petty tribe once the next light period begins. It's safer." "It is, Yet I don't see the purpose of waiting so long, said Angela. My father wants the water tribe obliterated, and he wants it to happen as soon as possible. There are no pending threats of waterbenders in the southern water tribe, so attacking with firebenders would be an advantage if the sun was up. But since it's not, the obvious course of action is to assemble non-bender warriors and use them to pummel the savages into surrender as quickly as possible. There isn't much left of their tribe, according to the reports, so we could achieve victory in a matter of a few weeks. You'd have your region to govern, Admiral Chan, and you can go home to fight a war worthy of your titles, General Bujing. Is everyone happy with this course of action? The 6 men in the room were astounded and stared at her in something reminiscent of awe, but they returned to their usual attitudes once they recalled the ideas had come from a female, which apparently diminished the impact of Angela's words. And how, exactly, would you have the non-benders attack the water tribe? Asked Commander Tsang. Did you think so far already, Princess? Do I have to? She asked, disdaining him with her glare. I believed I had cleared the pathway so whichever one of you could come up with the rest of the plans, but if you are not competent enough to do so, then I truly might have to. We aren't incompetent, yelled Captain Tao, as emotional as ever, his outburst masking the sound of the creaking door behind him. Angela frowned, wondering if the door had been ajar all along. She guessed it must have been, and even if it hadn't been, she was too busy trashing an insolent captain to waste her attention on the door. Then prove it, grunted Angela. Or are you, by any chance, so intimidated by the water tribe savages' prowess that you can't develop a decent strategy to annihilate them for good? None of that, replied Tao, apparently forgetting who he was dealing with. I'm more than capable of defeating anything the water tribe has to offer. But his words proved to be completely hollow. Because at that very moment, his statement was tested, and the squeal that came out of him when the smoke started to spread through the room showed he was unworthy of his position as captain. Angela berated herself briefly for ignoring her instincts. Of course the door hadn't been ajar before. The smoke came out with a loud bang from the bomb, and the 6 men jumped immediately. They were panicking, searching for the source of the gas and crashing against each other in the process. Angela dropped to the ground instantly, discovering the bomb responsible for the smoke was only a few inches away from her. And, on the room's threshold, amongst the dark gas that was befogging the room, she saw boots made of some sort of animal skin she couldn't recognize. She didn't need to see more to understand the water tribe hadn't wasted their time and had already orchestrated an attack upon them on the first days of the dark period. Oh, how foolish of them. Had they only been a little more patient, she would have been back home and they would have only dealt with 6 useless soldiers, but they had chosen their own demise. And Angela had no qualms with being the one to deliver their doom. The boots moved, stepping inside the room. Angela was certain the owner of said shoes was about to slay them all or to usher an announcement about the group being his prisoners. Don't move, yelled a man's voice. If you cooperate, this will be a lot easier on you all. You're all becoming hostages of the water tribe. So kidnapping it was. Angela wasn't so bothered by the smoke that she couldn't let out a small chuckle of disbelief. This man had to be kidding. How dare you? You shall pay for what you're, said General Mack, but the warrior interrupted him. Be quiet and do as I say or else, yelled the kidnapper, and he was also interrupted, but not by words this time. An unforeseen array of blue fire struck his boots, forcing him back into the hallway, and he collapsed as he tried to shake off the flames dancing on his feet. Sokka saw a shadow move towards him while he smacked his smoking boots, the feeling of fire still clinging to them even when he had smothered the flames already. He frowned as the person who had attacked him stood up, and he caught sight of another blue flame in his attacker's hand. Or else, what? Said a feminine voice, to his dismay. He stood up again and held his club high, hoping his enemy could see he was armed and willing to attack, no matter who he was dealing with. Stay back or I'll break your head, he said, and his opponent laughed at him. I would love to see you try, muttered the woman. Because it sounded like a woman, or was it a very girly man? He wished for the latter, since beating a girl up wasn't part of his plans. But it became an essential part of them when he found she had no reserves about attacking him by throwing an amazing fireball straight to his face. Could she see him despite not having a mask like his? He didn't know, and he didn't wish to know either. He saw the fire coming, ducked, and made a run for it, absolutely aghast. How could this person firebend without any difficulty even though the sun was gone? Was she so powerful that this was only half of her skill? It seemed unlikely, but it was the only plausible explanation he could come up with as he ran, chased away by blue fire. Angela walked into the hallway and took deep breaths once she found clean air. She had been able to withstand the smoke, but it still had damaged her system slightly. She continued rinsing her lungs as she saw her two royal guards, the ones that had been standing by the door, passed out on the floor, probably due to overwhelming blows to the head. She saw the Water Tribe warrior sprint away and toss another smoke bomb in her direction, probably trying to lure her outside so he could take her on with his warrior friends. Oh, he would regret that deeply. No plain Water Tribe warrior could cross blows with her and come out of the strife unharmed. She took a deep breath when the smoke began spreading from the new bomb and she chased after the warrior, who had already exited the building and was yelling something at his allies. "Haka! Katon!" yelled Sokka, taking his gas mask off and dropping it on the ground. He waved at his men, who were currently standing on the walls. The Fire Nation guards that had still been on the wall before Sokka entered the building had been knocked into unconsciousness by the pair of warriors. Through his shouts and movements, Sokka caught Haka and Katon's attention quickly. "What's the matter?" asked Haka. "Please tell me you already caught all the hostages." "I didn't," admitted Sokka. "There's a weird firebender here that doesn't seem affected even if there's no sun. She even ushers out blue flames. I lured her out here, help me take her out or else we won't get any hostages at all." Wait, did you say she?" asked Katon, shocked. "Indeed, that's what he said." Sokka turned towards the entrance of the building, from where poured some smoke from his second bomb. The blurred shape he hadn't been able to discern earlier was walking towards him again, and now he could see the curves on the body, helping him confirm that his enemy really was a woman. Katon and Haka frowned and lifted their boomerangs as they saw the silhouette exiting the building, unwilling to waver in their intentions even if they were to face a female warrior. And Angela wouldn't have wanted it any other way. A smirk played in her face as she finally walked outside the cloud of smoke, standing in plain sight now. Sokka couldn't believe he found the fire-bending woman to be a striking beauty. But he blinked a few times to break the spell she seemed to unleash on his senses by reminding himself of all the damage the Fire Nation had done. Who cared if there was a beautiful woman among them? Surely she was as cruel as the rest of them. Well, he was wrong about that. She was far crueler than any of them, of course. "Stay back and we won't hurt you," grunted Sokka, his angry, blazing eyes proving he wouldn't hold back against her. Angela smirked at the ferocious glare of the savage, feeling actual joy upon facing off against a man who seemed to hate her just as he would hate any man from the Fire Nation. How wrong was it for her to feel glad to see he made no distinction among them? She didn't know, but the pride she felt to see she would finally be fighting against a man as equals was immeasurable. "I'm afraid I'm not the type to fall back against such pointless threats, Savage," she said, the smirk still growing on her face. "You believed you could hold us all as hostages inside the settlement, and you almost achieved your goal, but your luck was against you today. Because if I hadn't been inside, you probably would have caught those useless minions of my father's, but I happened to be there too. And I will not hesitate to bring you down if you're stupid enough to defy me." "Oh, I'm stupid all right," said Sokka, gripping his boomerang in one hand and his club on another. "But I think I have the upper hand here. You're completely outnumbered. Surrender and you won't get hurt." "I'm outnumbered," she repeated, with disbelief. "Do you truly believe that? There's an entire battalion of royal guards aboard my barge, and I'm certain they've already caught wind of what you petty savages are attempting to pull here. They'll come tear your group apart in a matter of minutes, that is, if I'm not done killing you all before they get here." Sokka would have laughed at the idea and thrown another threat right back at the girl, but her words started to piece together in his mind slowly. Her father's minions, the royal guards, no way. He wasn't dealing with the Fire Lord's daughter, or was he? "Well? Are you going to withdraw quietly into your huts again, or would you rather have me kill you and all your friends right now?" asked Angela. You can't be," said Sokka, taking a few steps back. Who the hell are you? Angela sighed dramatically, but she smiled once again as she took up a fighting stance. I don't see why you need such knowledge, since I couldn't care less about who you are, but I do understand that I've impressed you enough for your dying wish to be to discover my identity, she said, her arrogance irritating Sokka beyond belief. Stop jumping to conclusions, you. He growled, but she ignored his mumbling completely as she answered his question. I am Princess Angela, heir to the throne of the Fire Nation. Sokka didn't react in any other way than by snarling at her, while Katon and Haka stepped back, terrified. The plan might have been to capture hostages at first, but capturing the Fire Princess? If they managed to accomplish something like that, which seemed unlikely, all the armed forces of the Fire Nation would come tear apart their tribe until there was nothing left but blocks of ice. Sokka, said Haka. We have to. I know, growled Sokka, who had come to the same conclusion himself. I know. Oh, so now you are willing to stand back? I thought you were far more resilient than that, savage, she said, teasing his ego cruelly. Sokka's expression didn't change. You wish I were about to step back, just like every moron you've ever met that has backed down to let you get your way. He muttered. His defiant attitude came as no surprise for her. They don't back down as easily as you imagine, actually, she said. They don't? I guess they were probably too busy looking at your blue fire to remember they're supposed to let you get away with stuff, he finished, trying to save face, but Angela raised an inquisitive and indignant eyebrow at him. Excuse me? Looking at my what, exactly? I just said it, didn't I? Your blue fire. He said, flustered despite the lethal circumstances he was in. Angela was leaning slightly towards letting the rebellious savage live, for having displayed enough courage to defy her without crumbling, but his last comment set her off completely. Her smirk was replaced by a grimace as she set her hands on her hips. Oh, my blue fire, she repeated, infuriated. You really are nothing but an uncivilized buffoon, aren't you? And you're a pervert to boot. I'm not a pervert, yelled Sokka. Stop twisting my words to your liking, woman. To my liking. Do you think I want a wildling such as yourself to go around taking a look at At your what, exactly? Asked Sokka, defiant. At my blue fire, she muttered, enraged, and Sokka took another step back. The temperature was probably the same it had been all along, but somehow Sokka felt his body heat rise as he exchanged verbal blows with the princess, blows that had slowly developed into something utterly unexpected. Was Angela controlling the temperature with her fire-bending skills, or was the heat truly being produced by his embarrassment? Could firebenders control the weather in any way? He rather doubted it, but it would make reality much more bearable if he believed that. Oh okay, let's focus on the issue at hand, he said. You don't seem to be willing to cooperate by becoming a hostage, but I'm not walking out of here empty-handed. So, it's kill or die, I guess. It's only die for you, savage, she growled, and he lifted both his weapons. The name's Sokka, by the way. As if I wanted to know your name in the first place, she grunted, and seeing how he was getting ready to attack, she decided to strike first. She lifted her leg and kicked a blue fire blast straight at Sokka. After the strange innuendo from just now, Sokka jumped out the way of the fire but stared at it, feeling like a fool. What the hell had he been trying to say when he had said something so ridiculous? Angela forced him to return to reality when she lifted two fire-coated fists and aimed the blazes at his head. Sokka was surprised to see her fire wasn't as strong as he feared, since he managed to swipe both blows away with his club, which only heated up a little after the contact with the fire. Angela frowned at that and figured she would need to use more strength on this battle than what she had originally planned to. She struck another fire kick, a very potent one, and Sokka was forced to roll on the floor to avoid getting hurt. He tossed his boomerang at her, but she knocked it off course with her fist, and the weapon collapsed on the floor. Still, he took the chance to lunge at her with his club, determined to strike her and knock her unconscious. He knew what the consequences of kidnapping the Fire Lord's daughter would be, but if he took charge of the situation properly, his tribe might be favored, despite the circumstances. But he had been wrong to assume Angela would be so easy to knock down. She spun around when he swung the club at her and she used her feet to trip him. Sokka performed a barrel roll and jumped on his feet again, picking up his boomerang and attempting to strike Azula's shoulder with it. The princess avoided the blow, and she delivered an uppercut straight at Sokka's jaw, making him bite his tongue in the process. He stumbled forward as Azula smirked cruelly. Sokka spat, and his blood stained the formerly pure white snow. The pain he felt in his mouth was beyond anything he'd experienced so far, and to think she hadn't even used fire in that blow. If she caught him again, he was probably a gunner. "Sokka!" yelled Katon, as he and Haka climbed down the wall, racing towards their leader, but Sokka lifted an arm signaling for them to stop on their tracks. He couldn't believe it had come to this. All his plans thwarted by this accursed princess. He knew his plans weren't all that brilliant, but they could have worked. They had the upper hand on everything before, but now, even if he managed to outsmart Azula, he probably would end up on the losing end when the time came for bargains over her rescue. Indeed, the Fire Lord might even present himself in the South Pole to melt it down unless his daughter was returned safe and sound, that is, if Azula didn't sneak off on her own first. She looked like the feisty type to him. She was more than he could handle, no matter how much he hated to admit it to himself. How was he supposed to face his father when he told him how badly the mission had gone? Would the chief of the tribe be ashamed to call him his son for such failure? Nevertheless, there was still something he could do for his friends, even for himself. If they couldn't win, then at least they could return home and come back someday when that royal barge wasn't docked in the shore anymore. He would live to fight another day, and so would his men. Azula frowned in confusion when she saw Sokka pick up another smoke bomb, but she soon smirked at him. "Another one of those? Is it, by any chance, filled with a volatile gas?" "It better be. It's the sole way you might defeat me," she said, proudly. "That's interesting," he mumbled, though his jaw begged him not to say another word. "So the best way to beat a firebender is to drive their fire out of their control." "Indeed, but I think I just proved I need no fire to defeat you," she muttered, smirking. "You should feel ashamed a woman can beat you so easily." "Ashamed?" he repeated. "The sole shame I could feel is not being able to protect my people from the likes of you and your nation. You could be a platypus bear for all I care, being a woman has nothing to do with it." Azula's eyes widened upon those words. He didn't diminish her for being a woman, not even in the slightest. It hardly mattered to her that he had claimed he hated her nation altogether. His shame for losing this fight had nothing to do with his opponent being a woman. And as she allowed the words to sink in, Sokka took a last glance at his allies and flashed them his trademark crooked and confident smile. Both teenagers stared at the bomb in his hands in disbelief, understanding the meaning of Sokka's actions. They had dreaded it would come to this as soon as the woman had identified herself, and they couldn't do anything but watch as their leader threw the bomb to the ground, signaling all his allies to surrender when the red smoke spread quickly through the air. Azula returned to reality when she was swallowed by the red cloud. Why was it red this time? It took her an instant to realize it was probably a signal of some sort, of retreat, most likely. And if that was the case, she had to catch at least just Sokka before he could flee, since he probably had realized his warriors couldn't triumph in these conditions. Haka and Katon raced down the wall and ran outside the settlement, yelling at all their allies to retreat. The warriors outside had been witnesses to the red smoke that had spread upwards, and they did nothing but stare at it in disbelief, not understanding what circumstances could have forced Sokka to suspend the operation. "Move, you morons!" yelled Haka, pushing the others towards their village. "Retreat! Retreat now! Where's Sokka?" yelled Uro, who had been about to sprint for his life until he realized their leader was nowhere in sight. "He'll be with us later, but we have to run!" screamed Katon. "Believe in him. I won't leave him behind," said Uro, in denial. "We have to stay and wait for him." "No," said Haka, his blue eyes blazing ferociously. "We can't stay. Nobody can stay, or else we'll all get killed." Katon turned towards the ships and, with dismay, saw a group of men in red robes heading towards the settlement. They surely had seen the turmoil and the smoke, and they were going to capture them all if they didn't run now. "We have to, guys, we really have to run," he said, pointing at their enemies. Yuro's despair only grew when he saw what his friend was pointing at. But Sokka. He's strong, he's our leader, said Haka, determined. He'll make it through, I'm sure. But for now, we have to run. He'll be back with us soon, you'll see. Yuro was forced to obey his superior officer despite not wanting to, and Katon took it upon himself to guide the rest of the warriors back into the snowy terrains they knew so well. He chanced one last glance at the settlement once there were several yards between them and the Fire Nation base, and he hoped to see a figure sprinting through the snow towards them. Sokka struggled within the red smoke, not entirely certain of where he was going. He hoped, though, that he would manage to break out of the cloud soon enough, past the settlement's wall, chasing after his friends. But all hope vanished when the strong grip of a hand with long nails wrapped around his neck. The nails clawed at his skin, blood dripping from these new injuries, and he was forced to the ground by the owner of said hand, whom he had no difficulty placing. The cold snow underneath him did nothing to appease his despair as he struggled to escape Azula's grip, but the woman had impressive strength, and she held him down with her knee pressed against his back. Sokka swung his club in hopes to strike her arm, forcing her to withdraw her hand or end up with a broken bone, and when she pulled her hand away he used the opportunity to get her off him by twirling on the ground. He made another run for it after that, but he could hear her footsteps behind him, and it didn't take too long for Azula to catch up to him again. This time she lit up her feet with fire and kicked him on the back, scorching his clothes, to her satisfaction. The red smoke was fading slowly and she could see him crawl on the ground as he tried to regain his stance somehow. The flames that still danced on his back forced him to turn around and choke the fire with the snow. As he did, his eyes found the dark sky above him. It was the dark period, and yet he had failed to accomplish the mission. The thought kept repeating itself on his mind as everything in front of him grew clearer while the smoke dissipated. And once again, the hands with those fearsome claws gripped the front of his shirt, lifting him upwards. He could see Azula's features clearly, and despite how beautiful she was, all he wanted to do was bend her skull inwards with the club he still held in his hand. So, Sokka is your name, right? She said, smirking. Make sure you remember the day you underestimated Princess Azula of the Fire Nation, Sokka. Sokka lifted his club, enraged, but she threw him upwards and struck his abdomen after coating her right hand with fire, delivering a blow with the sufficient strength to break through his armor and burn directly his skin, marking his body with both her knuckles in her fire. Sokka's breath left him instantly, his club collapsed on the ground and he followed shortly, panting and cringing at the unbearable pain. Azula stared at the man with slight contempt, basking in her pride and superiority. She hadn't even broken a sweat while he was twitching against the snow, still coughing blood as he covered his burn with his hands, his face contorted with pain. She could deliver the finishing blow and spare him from his suffering, but she didn't want to. She enjoyed watching him writhing in this way. But then she recalled how he hadn't undermined her for being a woman, and her pleasure upon witnessing his pain vanished immediately. He was the only man so far who hadn't diminished her, the only one proud and brave enough to stand up to her even when he knew he couldn't win. She had to acknowledge he was worthy of praise for that, at least, and worthy to fight her another day, perhaps, if he was ever up to the challenge. Her royal guards finally arrived to find her looking down on the shivering man on the ground. 3 firebenders took a stance to strike him, but she raised her eyes towards them and said, "Wait." The man in the middle seemed puzzled, even though his face was covered with a mask. "Princess, he is a threat to your safety." "If he truly were, he wouldn't be squirming on the ground as he is," she stated, silencing her own guards. "I want this man to live." The statement took everyone aback, even Sokka, who had already discarded his life by now, breathing with difficulty under the world of pain the princess had inflicted upon him. Was she going to let him get away with everything? Why would she, though? Was there some sort of compassionate person beneath those layers of arrogance and power? "What will we do with him, then?" asked one of the guards, surprised. "He will be taken to the mainland," decided Azula. "He's bound to be a good slave." Sokka wanted to slap himself for being so naive. How could he have believed the woman would be merciful? She was her father's daughter, after all. She must have known he would rather be dead than serve the Fire Nation, and thus she decided to force the second option upon him. He truly would have preferred to drop dead than become their servant. "It will be done," said the guards at unison, and without any kindness whatsoever, they lifted Sokka and carried him away. Azula watched their figures shrink in the distance, and she took one last glance at the man who had dared defy her. She hoped he had learned the lesson, and she hoped said lesson would be relayed through all the Fire Nation, so that even the military figures that used to think lowly of her would realize she had saved the settlement and caught the leader of the Southern Water Tribe's resistance, so that they would understand, for once and for all, that she was not to be underestimated. Because she was Princess Azula, heir to the throne of the Fire Nation. Katara stared at the horizon once more, waiting, just waiting. On this occasion, though, she wasn't alone. Her father stood next to her, wondering when his son would come home, if he was to return at all. Shapes began materializing afar, and the two of them stared in hopes to identify the Water Tribe's outfits, and to their relief, the people approaching were clad in grey armors and blue cloth. But Katara frowned when she didn't see a tall, enthusiastic man outshining the rest of them. Heikeda's heart sank when he saw the expressions on the faces of the warriors. Just by looking at them, he understood what had happened, and he could only think he should have been harsher on his son. He shouldn't have let him undertake such perilous mission. Sokka. Where is? Mumbled Katara, walking towards Sokka. The teenager didn't even bother looking her in the eye, tilting his head down in shame. "I'm sorry," was all he could say, and indeed, it was the worst he could have said. Katara's eyes widened in horror as she shook her head, her entire body shivering, and not because of the cold. And no, it can't be," she said, tears escaping her eyes before she was even aware of it. "No. Where is he? Sokka? No." She was about to break in a sprint towards the Fire Nation settlement where she had lost her brother, but Heikeda grasped her by the wrist and held her back. Katara's tears kept trailing down her cheeks as she continued to yell. "Let go of me! Let go of me! I'm not going to let go," said Heikeda, tears dripping from his eyes as well as he embraced his daughter despite how she struggled to set herself free from his grasp. "You're the only thing I have left now. I won't ever let go of you, Katara." Katara was beyond reasoning, though. Eventually she would come to the same conclusion her father had reached, but right now, grief had overcome her entire being and she couldn't do anything but cry, wondering if she would at least get to see her brother's dead body, or if the Fire Nation would be merciful and let him live, by chance. Oh, she was fooling herself. There was no way that could happen. Her brother was gone, and all she could do was mourn him, promising him she would never forget about him. Promising she wouldn't give up to the Fire Nation, just as he had refused to surrender to them. Promising she would fight with her waterbending skills, in order to cast those monsters out of their territory. The sole rational thought in her head, amongst all the pain and sadness, was that she would honor her brother's memory, no matter what. Chapter 3, Introduction 3. Sand. Dirt. Heat. Blood. No longer could he recall the feeling of snow under his feet. The cold environment he had been born and raised in had been deadly, but within said danger, he had felt comfortable, at ease, at home. He was as far from home as he could be now. He had been far away for 2 long years already, and he could hardly remember his grandmother's face, his sister's voice, his father's embrace, his father. Was he disappointed in him? Had he been glad not to see him return home because he believed this was supposed to be Sokka's fate? He wanted to believe his father missed him, but it was so unlikely, so undeserved. He had asked for this himself, hadn't he? Heikeda had warned him, told him he knew nothing of the wages of war, and he had ignored him. He had been too cocky, too arrogant to think he could lose. But he had lost. And against that blasted princess, to boot. Her face haunted his every nightmare. It was extremely ironic that he would have trouble to recall the faces of his family and friends, but his enemies' features were always there, teasing him, asking if he had already learned what his place in the world was. He shook his head and closed his eyes, deciding he would rather think of the Water Tribe again than of that evil woman. He kept holding on to the hopes that his tribe still stood strong after he had been taken away from it. He figured he would have seen someone else from the Water Tribe in the mainland by now if the Fire Nation had conquered the frozen tundra. Yet it was also possible that the Ashmakers had been completely merciless with the Water Tribe, leaving no survivors, but in that case, he would have heard the rumors, right? From what he had seen for himself, the people of the Fire Nation still boasted about taking over the Air Nomads and Earth Kingdom, and he had heard no such claims about either of the Water Tribes so far. It was likely the Northern Water Tribe had managed to stand their ground. They were better prepared for wars than the people down at the South Pole, but he had heard most the armed forces of the Fire Nation were up north, attempting to seize control. Why, though, hadn't they moved down south already? He wasn't leading his people anymore. He doubted anyone was, unless either Haka or Catan had taken over his position. If they were still alive, that was. He didn't know if Princess Azula had sent out her men to pursue and chase down the rest of the warriors. Judging by how ruthless the woman had seemed to be, he wouldn't be surprised if she had. Chances were the Southern Water Tribe had been obliterated. But all he could do was hope that his people still stood strong somehow, resisting the Fire Nation's assaults. It was the only thing he could hold on to, as a matter of fact. It was the one thought that kept him from using his boomerang to slit his own throat. After being taken away from the South Pole, he had been thrown into Azula's royal barge, although he didn't see her again in the entire trip. She probably had forgotten he was on her vessel altogether. He was taken to the mainland, just as she commanded, and upon his arrival to the country he had been tossed in an internment camp amongst other people who resisted the Fire Nation's authority, most of them Earth Kingdom people who had refused to join the honorary Fire Nation citizen system. Sokka wasn't offered the chance to enter said system, but even if he had been given said opportunity, he would have never accepted it. The honorary Fire Nation citizens were people who had been born to other nations but had accepted the government of the Fire Nation as their own. As a reward for not resisting, they were given the chance to live almost at the same level as regular Fire Nation people. They were frowned upon and disdained by many original Fire Nation citizens, but their rights were almost even. There were Earthbenders in the Fire Nation's army now, and even some of the former Earth Kingdom noblemen had kept their titles after swearing fealty to the Fire Lord. Sokka wouldn't deny it was a convenient bargain for both the Fire Nation leaders and Earth Kingdom citizens, but he would never ever give up on his heritage, one of the few things he still had left, just to live a more comfortable life. Well, he hadn't been offered the chance to do so anyhow, but if he had been, he would have refused to accept it and spat on the face of whoever had asked him to be an honorary Fire Nation citizen to thank him for his troubles. The mere thought of becoming a Fire Nation citizen filled him with endless rage. And so, he had been measured and weighed by Fire Nation officials, the ones in charge of setting the slaves into different classes. Some slaves were set up for sale to become servants to whoever wanted to pay for them, while others were shipped off to the households of important noblemen. No payment was offered for the latter. Some of them were even shipped off to work at the Fire Lord's service, if they seemed promising enough to serve royalty. Some other slaves, the female ones, were forced to undertake some very distasteful activities, mostly involving pleasing men who paid for their services. Some slaves were found completely useless, those injured or handicapped, and they were sent to the executioner, and some were found strong enough to enter another category of service, the gladiators. To Sokka's surprise, he had been cast into the last category, and he was more than thrilled to see the guards returning his weapons to him, the ones he had been forced to relinquish upon his capture. But to his dismay, he was informed that his new duty would be to entertain people through the most outrageous and irrational idea the Fire Nation had come up with up to date. Sure, they had always been heartless, but this was, by far, the worst of all tortures. It was proof of how little humanity was left in the hearts of the Fire Nation people. Gladiator fights consisted in confronting two slaves with the weapons of their choice in a deadly combat, where the loser paid the price with his life and the winner had a chance to fight on another day against a new opponent. The fights took place in an arena, an arid perimeter coated by sand. The glow of the sun shone upon it on every battle. The stands on the arena Sokka fought in, there were several combat grounds throughout the Fire Nation, were rustic and made of wood, and they couldn't contain more than 200 people. At times the stands were full, at times they were almost completely empty, but regardless, the gladiators had to fight to the best of their ability under the midday sun, since all battles took place at noon. Sokka assumed it was because the Fire Nation people felt most empowered at that time, or maybe because they wanted to witness the fighters wear themselves out completely, since the sun's radiance was merciless at that time of the day, but he didn't actually know why. It really didn't matter much, since he was too invested in his struggle to survive to look for logic in a situation that didn't seem to have any. None of the gladiators had been previously trained to make the fights more interesting. Watching them despair as they tried to survive was far more appealing to the sadistic people that enjoyed the combats. Often Sokka heard that the superior league of gladiators was far kinder to its participants. Apparently, those battles didn't end based on who died and who lived, at least, not always. Truth to be told, he had no idea how those fights concluded, but apparently having a sponsor made reality far more bearable for gladiators, despite they were still nothing but slaves. Sokka didn't think having a sponsor would make much difference, for he hated being a gladiator altogether. Ever since he was thrown in the pit for the first time, he had loathed everything about this job. On his first combat, he had faced against a massive man who had a huge spear, a heavy sword and an axe as weapons. He managed to outsmart him after discerning his weak spots, and he knocked his rival out, and even though he was sure that would be enough, it wasn't. To his horror, he was commanded by the man who ran the arena to slay his opponent, no matter if his rival was clearly out of it. Sokka had refused, but then he had been threatened by both the crowd and the owner of the arena that, if he didn't kill his rival, the dead body would be his. Completely disgusted by the act, he had been forced to slam his opponent's head with his club. Blood splattered all over the sand, the red liquid had attached to his clothes and stained his very soul. He cried himself to sleep that night, wondering what had he done to deserve such a fate. His rival on the arena might have been a man not too different from himself, trying to survive in whichever way he could, hoping to return to a family that believed him dead, and now he really was dead. And not by the hands of a Fire Nation soldier, not by execution after rebelling against the heartless regime of this country, no. He had died because of a man who had no more rights to survive than he did. The more thought he gave to his job, the more he grew to hate it and to hate himself for not standing up against the chains that weighed him down. He had underestimated the Fire Nation's cruelty, and he was too scared of death to let his life slip through his fingers, to give up the fight and allow any of his rivals to slay him. Looking at himself from another perspective, he was simply pathetic. He was worthless and undeserving even of the life he had obtained. Several times he had been on the brink of death while facing fighters far more skilled than himself, but on the very second he had realized he was about to lose his life, his mind began flashing him images of the past, of the reasons why he had to strive for survival even in the direst times of his life. He had to return to his family, to hug his sister and promise her he would never leave her again, to apologize to his father and acknowledge he had been nothing but a fool. And one day, he would fight his worst enemy again. The next time he faced her he would be ready. The next time it would be him staring down on her weak, writhing figure, as she struggled to recover her breath on the ground. He would be the one to spare her life and fake mercy to only unleash upon her a hell beyond her imagination. And to fulfill all these things, he had to live somehow, even if it meant he had to kill all his fellow gladiators to achieve that purpose. Although it was easier said than done. Gladiators didn't make friends. They didn't stand together to support each other, because on the very moment you became acquaintances with someone, you would instantly condemn whatever union you could form with them. Huang Li, the man who ran the gladiator business in the Fire Nation town of Huiyi, kept a close watch on every gladiator, for the sole purpose of providing entertainment to his crowd by forcing two friends to kill each other on the sand pit. He was a truly cruel man, he only cared for the incomes the fights provided him with. If he was feeling particularly kind, and he had achieved a full house sale, he would hire a group of women from the nearby whorehouse so that they would take the worries out of his gladiators' minds by making use of their skills in bed. But this was still heartless towards the two different kinds of slaves. Both gladiators and prostitutes hated their jobs with all their hearts, and surprisingly often they didn't engage in mundane activities, for they preferred to simply sit next to each other as they reminisced the past times, when everything had been better. There was no top dog, no man foolish enough to bully another. They were all deeply conflicted. They missed the lives they had led before being caught by the Fire Nation and having this lifestyle imposed upon them. No one wanted to try to earn enemies just as they refused to make friends, because by the end of the day, they might not even be alive anymore. Developing any sort of bond, no matter of what nature, was simply pointless. Around 6 battles were fought each day, most of them took place at broad daylight. Rainy days were most welcome by any of the gladiators since they meant nobody would perish then, although it also meant Huang Li would be on a terrible mood. He was heartless indeed. No job was more suitable for a man like him than to administer the deadly business of the amateur gladiators. The sun was quite high when Sokka was summoned by Huang Li to head into combat today. The barracks where the gladiators lived were an old and musty building. There was no distinguishing the rooms where the combatants slept, since there were no rooms at all. In the center of the building stood a fireplace where their meals were cooked by whoever Huang Li felt like forcing the job upon. Sokka would always lie down far from the fire, for he had grown to hate the element with more passion than ever during the past few years, but he also liked to spend his time on the coldest corners of the building because, at times, if he let his mind wander long enough, he could imagine he was back home. "Hey, Dummerang," Huang Li called him. "Time to hit the sand. You're up against Ching today." Sokka didn't even bother to correct the way Huang Li addressed him. He had grown used to being called Dummerang by this man, and he didn't want him to call him by his real name anyways. There were a few things he hadn't relinquished to the Fire Nation, his name being one of them. To imagine getting called by his name by any of these monstrous people revolted him, for even his name was another relic of the home he had lost so long ago. He only reminded himself of it when he needed to remember his purpose of returning to the South Pole, of defeating Princess Azula someday. He took his weapons without saying a word. He could hardly recall the sound of his own voice by now. Huang Li led the way towards the arena and Sokka followed, his brow contracted as he filled himself with determination. Whoever stood in his way would fall, no matter what story existed behind their eyes. Whatever he did, he would do it for the sake of returning home. By the time they reached the arena he could hear the roar of the crowd. Judging by the sound, there had to be about 100 people out there at least. Huang Li would be pleased. His weapons in hand, he walked into the sandy enclosure, his heart beating wildly as he entered the sand pit to face a battle he might not survive. Azula tried her best to stay calm as she strode down the hallway, her feet carrying her towards her room with her usual powerful strides. All the servants nearby cowered in fear at the sight of her. The princess was already terrifying when she was in a good mood, but right now she looked mad enough to murder whoever stood in her way. And she was, although she only wanted to kill one man, or perhaps two, and their identities were quite specific. Killing a mere servant wouldn't help her solve her problem, even though murdering somebody might just help her release her fury. She slammed the door of her room as soon as she was inside, and she finally felt free to unleash her rage. She uttered a few cries and roars of anger as she recalled the decision her father had reached in the meeting that had ended just a few minutes ago. The thought made her entire body shiver in rage and she let out another howl of wrath, this time accompanied by the blue fire that escaped her throat along with her wails. Oh, how she regretted not having cleared everything up when she had the chance. If only she had told her father that Admiral Chan had lied when he had claimed he had single-handedly dealt with the Water Tribe warriors that attacked the settlement. She hadn't been too bothered when Chan stole all the credit at first, because she found it unimportant to reveal the truth at the moment. All the men in the settlement knew Chan had lied. They were perfectly aware that Azula was the one they owed their lives to. Chan himself knew it well enough, but to avoid having his titles stripped off him for his incompetence, and to ensure he would govern over the South Pole once they conquered it, he had claimed he was the one who had saved the group from being kidnapped by savages. Azula had taken a few detours before returning to the capital, one of them to drop off the Southern Water Tribe warrior she had brought as a slave to the Fire Nation, and when she finally presented herself before her father, he said he was glad to see she was fine and told her they truly owed Admiral Chan for keeping her safe during the attack to the settlement. The infamous man had been there at the moment, and he had the guts to smirk at the princess, letting her realize her father hadn't misunderstood a thing, he simply had been lied to. She didn't care much about who took the credit for beating the Water Tribe savage to a pulp, it wasn't something important to her. But she had felt she held a certain power over Chan, since she was well aware of the truth, and if her father discovered the actual story behind what happened at the settlement, Chan would pay a dire price for his deceit. But 2 years had passed, and her threat over the man had grown weaker, both in her head and in reality, as the events from the South Pole became fainter and less relevant over time. But all of a sudden, Chan had turned the tables and abused his power in the worst possible way he could have. She felt like hiring an assassin to take him out, but discarded the idea soon enough. She wanted to be the one responsible for spilling his blood all over the place, his blood, and the blood of that disgusting son of his. There was a knock at her door. She glared at it angrily, imagining the wooden plank bursting aflame for a moment before she decided to open it. "What?" she snapped to the servant on the other side of the door. The man fell to the ground in reverence, trembling. Lady Mai and Lady Tai Li have arrived, princess," he muttered, terrified. He had been warned that she wasn't in a good mood, but he had a duty to fulfill, but under these circumstances, it might be the last time he fulfilled anything at all. Angela's eyebrow twitched when she heard the news and she shook her head in irritation. "What are they here for? I'm not in the mood for visitors. They should only drop by on the days when I expressly ask for their presence." "But why you did, princess?" muttered the man. Angela frowned as she realized the servant was right. Today was the day of the week she set apart without fail to reunite with her two friends. She let out another groan of despair, resting her hands on her hips as she wondered if she should simply send the two girls home and tell them to meet her again next week, but she sighed, rolled her eyes and gestured the servant to get out of her way, which he did in a heartbeat as Angela walked down the hall to meet her friends. Tai Li was kneeling next to Mai, who was sitting on a couch, by the time Angela entered the room where they usually met. Tai Li was muttering a few things to her friend's womb and, as ever, Mai stared at her with a skeptical look on her face. "Who is the cutest baby in the world even if he's not born yet?" asked Tai Li, making Mai sigh. "I don't think he can hear you," muttered Mai, irritated. "What are you doing, Tai Li?" asked Angela, making her presence known. Her foul mood surprising both girls. They were used to seeing Angela suffering from strange mood swings once in a while, but when she was truly upset she definitely wasn't fun to hang with. "I was just talking to, are you okay, Angela?" she asked, not worrying about getting herself into a dangerous situation by asking this question. Naturally, Tai Li's inquiry made Angela's frown deepen. She walked towards one of the windows in the room to catch some fresh air, hoping to calm down through breathing deeply, so that she wouldn't end up venting the entirety of her stress on her friends. "How's the pregnancy coming along, Mai?" she asked, attempting to change the subject even though she was unable to forget about it altogether. "Everything's fine as it is. I'm only on my 4th month, though," said Mai, but she was also eyeing Angela with concern. "Good," muttered Angela, still glaring at the horizon, her mind clearly anywhere but within the 4 walls that stood around her. "Angela?" asked Tai Li again, forcing the princess to frown once again. "What?" she said, turning to face her friend, her enraged eyes trying to send a message that clearly spelled, "Quit pestering me." "There's something wrong with you," said Tai Li, staring at her with genuine concern. "I've known you for long enough to realize something like that." Angela's frown deepened and she folded her arms as she replied. "Your mind-reading skills amaze me, Tai Li. I should give you an award for being able to tell something bothers me. You're truly remarkable for sensing my annoyance." I don't appreciate the sarcasm, you know," muttered the girl, a little flustered. "Indeed, you don't and neither do I," grunted Angela, confusing Tai Li. "You can tell something bothers me, yet you pester me about telling you what it is that bothers me when explaining this is the last thing I want to do." "Well, for all you know it might help if you talk to us," said Tai Li, shrugging. "I don't think so," muttered Angela, irked. "I'm too upset to think about this rationally." "Come on, give it a try," Tai Li encouraged her, smiling brightly. The joyous look on her face made Angela feel like punching her. How could she smile like that when so many things were at stake in her life? Well, Tai Li knew not of these matters, and she probably wouldn't understand if she explained them anyway. She didn't understand a few things about it herself, to be honest. Why had she let Admiral Chan get away with stealing all the credit of her grand endeavor? If only she had been smart enough not to give him an edge on her. "I don't feel like it, Tai Li. And I'm not in the mood to deal with your happy-go-lucky attitude either," grunted Angela. Tai Li's face fell and she stared at her friend with concerned eyes. Then, you want us to leave?" "If that's what you want, I guess we can go." Angela sighed, knowing her friend was pulling her ace on her by letting her cutting words get through and ending up on the verge of tears. She sighed and rolled her eyes as Mai smirked, used to seeing Angela give up on arguments for the sole sake of not having to deal with Tai Li's emotional outbursts. "I didn't say that," muttered Angela. We meet every week, that's how it's supposed to be, or else I'll probably end up losing my mind to the pressures. What happened to you? Asked Mai this time, raising an eyebrow. Angela sighed and fixed her gaze on the floor, trying to keep her anger in check. But explaining the source of her fury promised she wouldn't be able to stay as calm as she wanted to be. Do you both recall what happened to me about 2 years ago, when I returned from the settlement down at the South Pole? Oh, back when Admiral Chan stole all the credit for defeating the warriors of the Water Tribe. Asked Ty Lee, all trace of her previous dejection gone completely. Exactly, said Angela, bitterly. I took a detour on my way home to drop off a souvenir at a slave internment camp. Admiral Chan beat me to the capital and fed a pile of lies to my father. I didn't bother correcting him. I didn't believe it necessary back then, for I was certain Chan's conscience would reprimand him for being unable to stand his ground against savages while I did it without a hitch. The other soldiers who were present at the settlement during that event have grown to admire and respect me. Chan, though, never truly did. I was sure he would realize one day just how low his actions were. But he never did, right? Said Ty Lee, sighing. Of course not, muttered Angela. My father told him, back when he lied about what happened in the South Pole, that he would reward him with anything for saving my life. Chan said he had nothing in mind at the moment, and I was certain that meant he didn't dare ask for compensation when he knew he wasn't worthy of it. And I was proven wrong today. It has been 2 years since then, and finally he came up with an idea for my father to thank him for what he didn't even do. Ty Lee gulped when she saw the furious way in which Angela's eyes gleamed now, and she started to regret asking her friend about her troubles now, but Maya wasn't giving up halfway through the story. What did he ask for? She muttered, wary of the answer. Angela bared her teeth as she replied, enraged. His blasted request was that his useless son would be allowed to take my hand in marriage. Ty Lee's jaw dropped, shocked by the revelation as she was, and even Mai, who always had a very bleak expression on her face, couldn't help but stare at Angela, dumbstruck. That's just, but that can't be, said Ty Lee. Isn't that the same boy we met at Ember Island? Yes, grunted Angela. I don't see how he would agree to marry me when I deliberately burned down his house, but I guess the thought of marrying the Fire Lord's daughter is appealing enough for him to forget about that. But, this isn't definitive yet, is it? Asked Ty Lee. It might as well be, grunted Angela. I just came from a meeting with my father and Admiral Chan. They're both extremely enthusiastic about deciding my future for me, without even taking my opinion upon the matter into account. But, did you tell your father you didn't want to marry Chan's son? Asked Ty Lee. I wasn't allowed to intervene, she muttered bitterly. I could only listen and hold back from frying Chan's head with lightning every time he opened that foul mouth of his to stroke my father's ego and convince him this was the best idea they've ever had. That's so sneaky, it's really low, muttered Ty Lee, understanding now why Angela seemed so disturbed. I thought he was more honorable than that. Of course not, replied Angela. Honor has become little more than a myth these days, especially amongst the Fire Nation military. They're too busy trying to attain the highest ranks to care about how they reach their goals. Disgusting, muttered Mai, and Angela couldn't have agreed more. But I don't know what you think, but arranged marriages aren't always so bad, muttered Ty Lee, trying to give some hope to Angela. My parents get along great and it was an arranged marriage. Well, I can't say the same about my parents, grunted Angela. My mother was too feeble to fight back when she was forced to marry my father. She didn't want him, yet she accepted the marriage proposal, probably because her family would be honored by her decision. Still, she only ever made herself unhappy, henceforth making him unhappy also. She was always too weak to stand up for herself, and I'm nothing like her. I won't let the same thing happen to me. Ty Lee seemed a little relieved to see Angela refused to surrender to her father or Admiral Chan, but there was a simple question that still needed to be answered, and Mai took it upon herself to ask it. And how, exactly, will you fight against what they're imposing upon you? Angela's frown deepened. She had been too busy basking in her rage to think things through. She knew she would have to, eventually, but she didn't know if she was emotionally steady enough to start pondering these matters. But she took a deep breath and faced her challenge head on, just as she faced everything in her life. Well, there's a very simple solution, she muttered. I could take it upon myself to slay both men from the Chan lineage and... No killing, said Ty Lee, grimacing. It's awful to think about killing them, and can you imagine what would happen if you got caught? Angela had stared at her with disapproval at first, but Ty Lee's second argument made more sense than she thought it would. As much as I hate to admit it, you're probably right about that, she muttered, sighing. Well, then, is there any other way? The other two were deep in thought as they tried to find a solution, but nothing came to their minds. Angela decided then to analyze the situation step by step. It would be simpler to find the pieces of the puzzle first and put them together afterwards. My final objective should be to prove to my father that my marriage to Chan will damage our lineage, muttered Angela. To accomplish this, I must prove he's not worthy of my hand in marriage, of course. How can I prove this? How about you challenge him to an Agni Kai? Asked Ty Lee. He's a non-bender, muttered Mai. Non-benders can't fight Agni Kais. Oh, but I'm sure he could. He wouldn't survive, of course, but it could be done. Said Angela, a vicious smirk on her face now. Well, the mean smile is back, said Ty Lee, slightly relieved. That's a good sign, but we said you shouldn't kill him, so no Agni Kai. Angela sighed and stared at her nails as she pressed her mind to develop a ploy, any sort of ploy. The problem is that Chan is useless, she muttered. He lives by his father's glory, holding no talents of his own. He's not a good warrior, he's not a good soldier, he's not good at anything, I think. Well, that should do it, said Mai, shrugging. If he's so useless, the Fire Lord should understand your refusal to marry him. That won't be enough, muttered Angela. I have to diminish him until there's nothing left of him. I ought to humiliate him completely to prove how pathetic he is. If that's what you're after, then, you should hit him where it hurts, said Mai. Being a nobleman's son, he must have a hobby of some sort, right? Even if he has no talents, there has to be something else. I've heard he sponsors a gladiator with his father's money, but that really doesn't count, does it? Asked Ty Lee, raising an eyebrow. Angela frowned at her words. Probably not. I don't see what we could do with this. Muttered Mai. Isn't there anything else? I don't know, to be honest, muttered Ty Lee. Your gossip skills are finally being put to the test and you're failing. Asked Mai, disappointed. Hey. I'm not a gossip. Squealed Ty Lee, blushing. Yeah, you're not a gossip, said Mai sarcastically. And I'm an air nomad. Quit it. Yelled Ty Lee, extremely embarrassed. I only hear information and pass on whatever I find interesting. It doesn't make me a gossip. It sure does, said Mai, her face still unexpressive although she was having a lot of fun by teasing her friend. You're not just a gossip, you're the queen of gossip. Don't you agree, Angela? Angela. The princess had ignored the last portion of the conversation between her two friends as an idea started to take shape within her mind. The emotion in her eyes was no longer anger but cleverness as she paced around the room, as she finally concocted her plan, the pieces of the puzzle coming together far quicker than she imagined they would. Are you okay? Asked Ty Lee, but Angela lifted a hand on her direction in a gesture asking her wordlessly to keep quiet. She began chuckling and she nodded once her plan was ready. Oh, it was risky, it was dangerous. She was bound to end up buried in an avalanche of trouble if something went wrong at some point. It was going to be very difficult indeed. But she loved the idea, and up until now, she knew of nothing that could prevent her from making a place for herself in that strange world that didn't stand too far from her grasp. I think I have it, she said, smirking. I think I know how to prove my superiority, how to crush him completely and blow his pride to smithereens. Both Ty Lee and Mai were glad to see Angela back to her usual defiant and determined self, but they couldn't deny it was still a terrifying sight. What had she come up with this time? Nice to know, I guess. Said Ty Lee, gulping. Well? What is it? Asked Mai. What are you going to do? Angela's smirk widened as she turned to face both girls, her eyes blazing with malice. And once she delivered her statement, both Mai and Ty Lee stared at her in disbelief, their eyes so wide Angela could have sworn they were bound to fall out of their sockets. Yet it was natural for them to react like this when they heard her declare, proudly, "I'm going to sponsor a gladiator." Chapter 4, Introduction 4. The wheels of the carriage spun too slowly for Tai Li and Mai's liking. Both girls wanted this matter to be done with as quickly as possible, for they had unwillingly followed Angela into the town of Huiyi to look for her gladiator. Tai Li had done everything in her power to talk Angela out of such a crazy decision, and Mai as well told her she was crazy to even consider sponsoring someone in the Superior Gladiator League. There were several reasons why they believed this would be nothing but trouble. One of them was that the royals had no reason to get involved in gladiator fights. Making slaves beat each other up was a very unpleasant activity, and why should royals find entertainment in this lowly business when there were important wars to fight against the nations that still resisted them? The gladiator business had been set up several years ago so that simple noblemen could entertain themselves somehow. The royalty of the Fire Nation had such duties to undertake that investing their time in such low pastime would have been simply ludicrous. The other reason, though, did nothing but fuel Angela's urge to hire a gladiator. No woman had ever sponsored a gladiator before. Sponsors in the Superior League were exclusively male. There were female gladiators, but female sponsors were unheard of. Apparently, women in the Fire Nation were too delicate to witness two slaves sparring. It was either that, or perhaps their husbands refused to lend them any money to hire a gladiator. Whichever the reason was, Angela couldn't help but frown at the thought. She loathed this misogynistic culture. She would beat down any obstacle in her way to prove she was superior to all the men that kept thinking otherwise. And if having her own gladiator would help her achieve her goal, so be it. Therefore, Angela had requested a carriage to take her all the way to the town of Huiyi. She had selected this town because the capital only held an arena for the Superior Gladiator League, and any gladiator involved in said league was already sponsored by someone else. In order to find a good gladiator who had yet to be sponsored, she had to find an arena of amateur gladiators, and the closest one to the Fire Nation capital was the arena in the very same town where she had dropped off the Water Tribe warrior from a few years ago. As the carriage pulled by Komodo rhinos moved closer to Huiyi, she wondered if that man still lived. It was unlikely he did, though. Given his circumstances, Angela didn't doubt he would have been turned into a gladiator. But amateur gladiator fights were wild and deadly. Angela had heard the average amateur gladiator survived only for 6 months, and the weakling she had dealt with down at the South Pole had lacked the build or skills to make it through 2 years at the rough regime of gladiators. "Why did you drag us here, Angela?" asked Tai Li, staring through the window in distaste as they entered the old town, which was a very low-class place in comparison to what the 3 girls were used to. The houses were old, the paint on their walls was faded and the tiles on their roofs were broken more often than not. The roads were bumpy, too, and the few people Tai Li had seen looked sick, elderly, or underfed. "I didn't feel like coming alone," replied Angela, simply. "You two can help me select the most appropriate gladiator for me." Mai raised an inquisitive eyebrow as she eyed her friend with concern. Angela was so logical and thoughtful about everything she did, this whim of getting a gladiator was nothing like her usual self. 3 girls, a princess, and 2 daughters of noblemen, heading into a god-forsaken town like this one was way too reckless a decision, especially for Angela. "And how exactly would we do that?" muttered Mai. "Tai Li and I don't have much knowledge either about gladiators or about skilled fighters." "Don't try to fool me," said Angela. "You're a skilled fighter yourself, Mai, and so is Tai Li. Maybe you two don't show it to anyone else, but I've seen your prowess with knives and Tai Li's chi-blocking tactics. So even if you want to pretend you're an ignorant about fighting, I know you're lying." Mai sighed in mild resignation, but she still wouldn't give up on her efforts to prove just how useless her presence was in these circumstances. "Nevertheless, it doesn't mean I can identify who's a great fighter and who isn't," she muttered. "And besides," said Tai Li, gulping, "I really don't want to watch an amateur gladiator fight. They're horrible, from what I've heard." "Toughen up, Tai Li," said Angela, as the carriage finally halted. "Facing death firsthand will make you respect it far more than never witnessing it in your life." But I don't want to have anything to do with this," whined Tai Li, but Angela ignored her curtly as the driver of the carriage opened the door to help the girls out. Angela couldn't help but frown when her feet hit the filthy ground. This was, most definitely, no place for a girl of her standards. Ty Lee seemed to agree with those thoughts as she looked around herself, utterly uncomfortable by their surroundings. "Is that it?" asked Mai, as she got off the carriage and stared at the ragged building in front of them. "Apparently," muttered Angela, her contempt evident on the expression in her face. "I don't like this place." "I don't like it one bit," muttered Ty Lee, gulping. Her words reminded Angela that she hadn't come simply to judge if the town was decent enough for her or not. She didn't look at her friend as she replied. "No one said you had to like it. We're not here on vacation or anything of the sort, we're here to find my gladiator." Ty Lee sighed in resignation as she followed Angela into the worn-out building, with Mai treading right behind them. Angela detailed the wooden vestibule once she entered it. There was a man behind the counter on the opposite wall to the front door, and adjacent to said counter were two doors, which, Angela assumed, would lead them to the stands from where they would witness the gladiator fights. A chalkboard with the names of some fighters scribbled over it was hanging behind the man at the counter, who smiled at the girls as he saw them enter the building. Angela didn't take his enthusiasm to be genuine. There had to be an ulterior motive for his apparent cheerfulness. She didn't know this at the moment, but the reasoning behind his smile was that anyone who entered the premises of the arena would have to pay a fee to sit at the stands, and the man would be more than happy to charge the three of them for the proper cost. "Welcome, ladies," he said with a joyous voice that produced different effects on the three girls. Angela frowned, distrustful, as usual. Ty Lee smiled at him, glad to see a friendly face. Mai ignored him completely, only caring for whatever Angela decided to do now. "How may I help you?" Angela scanned the board behind the man before answering his question. "It's the first time we've come to an amateur gladiator fight. What are we supposed to do?" she asked, with her trademark authoritarian voice tone. "I figured as much," he said, smiling kindly. Huiyi's amateur arena had never been visited by high-class women such as these until today. "First of all, you must pay a fee to take your seats at the stands." "Oh," said Angela, surprised. She didn't recall having to pay to enter any gladiator fights in the Superior League. "And you plan to charge me?" Why shouldn't I?" asked the man, confused. You don't know who I am, do you?" she asked, a smirk playing on her lips. "Oh, well. I suppose it wouldn't be appropriate to use my position to get out of paying all the time." The princess slid her hands into her pockets, but she found no form of money within them. She wasn't surprised by that, although she had held on to the silly hopes that she might find a few coins hiding within her clothes. Ty Lee seemed to be facing the same situation as she checked the contents of her purse to no avail. Mai rolled her eyes as she took out a pouch from her own purse. "How much is it for each?" she asked. It's 10 yuans per person," replied the man, surprised to see the girls struggling to find money. Apparently, high-class people didn't carry cash with them so freely. Mai placed a few coins on the counter. The man immediately began counting them as Angela and Ty Lee thanked their friend. "Gee, thanks for that, Mai," said Ty Lee, hugging her happily. "I'll make sure to pay you back," promised Angela. "You'd better," replied the other. "You both should learn to carry money with you." "The wisdom of a married woman speaking," asked Angela teasingly, earning herself a glare from Mai. "Ha ha, very funny," she grunted, as the other two smiled at her. "Very well, everything's in order," said the man behind the counter. "The three of you are free to pass through these doors and take a seat on the stands to watch the fight. You can also make your bets here, setting some money on the gladiator you think will win." "Make bets?" asked Angela, raising an eyebrow. "You could pay your friend back if you choose the right fighter," said the man, winking at her. Angela felt like punching him straight in the face for the gesture. "It sounds like a nice idea, that way we wouldn't owe Mai anything," said Ty Lee, smiling. "And with whose money, exactly, do you plan on placing your bets with?" growled Mai, irritated. "Who will pay up if you two lose?" "I don't think I'd choose the wrong gladiator," said Angela. "But I would need to know them before selecting one over another." "The fight that's about to happen is between the Dart Slayer and the Blue Wolf," said the man. "There will be more combats later, but you can simply bid on this one, I reckon. One fight should do, agreed Angela. Well? Who's the better fighter out of those two? I'm not sure, to be honest, said the man, chuckling. The Dart Slayer is very powerful and he's been around for about 3 months. He fights using a scimitar and darts with some strange properties that numb his opponent whenever he hits them. Darts that numb people? Sounds like a combination of what we both do, said Tai Li, smiling at Mai, who nodded in agreement. And what about the other one? Asked Angela. I really don't know how to describe him, the man admitted. He's somewhat strange. He has a few weapons, but they're nothing outstanding. I don't really understand how he's managed to survive for 2 years straight. Survived for 2 years? Repeated Angela. Yet his fighting style isn't extraordinary. No, well, not for someone like me, admitted the man. I don't know much about martial arts, I'm just in charge of the money. I see. Muttered Angela, thoughtful. She debated internally the situation and she nodded at Mai. I'd appreciate it if you didn't mind giving him 10 more yuans. I will bet on the Blue Wolf. In that case, I'll bet on him too. Said Tai Li, cheerful. Mai's mood soured more as she handed the money to the man. He smiled at her sympathetically as he wrote down the bets Angela and Tai Li had decided to make, and he handed the list of bids to the girls. Sign your names here, and, once the fight is done, you can come back to get your money if you've won. Angela nodded and took the brush from the man's hand, dipping it in ink before signing the paper. Tai Li did the same, and the 3 of them took their leave, entering the stands a few minutes before the battle began. The man hummed a happy tune as he stacked the money along with the rest of the bidding funds, and it wasn't until later that he looked at the paper the girls had left on the counter. He scanned the second to last name, and as he did, his jaw dropped in shock. No way, that was Princess Angela. He yelled, growing pale as he realized he had charged the arena's entrance fee to the Fire Lord's daughter. Angela led the way through the stands, and Tai Li and Mai followed suit. None of them was fond of walking amongst commoners, they were being judged by every single person who saw them, and that was bound to be everyone within the stands, actually. Their attires stood out since they were far classier than what the people who attended the amateur gladiators fights could afford, although, if they didn't waste money in something as pointless as amateur gladiator fights, they probably wouldn't have much trouble with money, Angela thought. They finally found an opening within the crowd, and they dropped on the creaking wooden seats, the 3 of them frowning when their rears hit the uncomfortable, hard planks they were supposed to sit on. Seriously, why did you bring us along? Asked Mai, irked. You could have made it all the way here without us. Quit whining so much, said Angela. You're just mad because we're using your money. It's really cheap of you to be complaining about that, you know. Said Tai Li, folding her arms. You've got mounds of gold back home, don't you? Don't you two have mounds of money as well? Asked Mai, the frown in her face growing with each passing moment. Well, I guess, and that's why you can be sure that we'll be paying you back even if the gladiator we chose loses. Said Tai Li cheerfully, but her enthusiasm wasn't contagious. Mai glared at her and turned to look at the arena as she muttered. This sucks. Angela had ignored her friend's conversation as she detailed the grounds where the battle would take place. She had seen the sandy pit of the Superior Gladiator League a few times, and within it were several obstacles and objects the gladiators could use to make the fight more interesting, but this sand ring was completely different from that of the Grand Royal Dome. The sand in itself was filthy, blotches of black stained it in many places, making it look like nobody ever bothered to clean it. No objects or obstacles were in sight, apparently they were unnecessary here. Angela assumed that the only fun part about these fights was watching the combatants slit each other's throats. 2 gates at opposite ends of the pit opened then, and the crowd roared wildly. Angela frowned at the irritating noise, and she tried to ignore it as she saw 2 men walking into the sand. The one entering from the left wing of the stadium wore a green armor to cover his humongous body, the scimitar hanging on his back helped her identify him as the Dart Slayer. At the other end, a less burly man walked out on the arena. His helmet was shaped as a wolf's head, and it sheltered his head and neck. The clothes and armor covering the rest of his tan body were blue, reminding Angela of someone she couldn't quite place right away. A man on his 40s jumped onto a scaffold by the edge of the stands, bringing everyone's eyes to him as he yelled, "On to the next battle, my friends!" He yelled, and another roar from the crowd told him people were expectant to witness the slaughter. From the old Earth Kingdom's wastelands, a tough and buff fighter with several tricks under his sleeve, it's the Dart Slayer. The Dart Slayer yelled and roared just as enthusiastically as his supporters, making Angela wince at his attitude. She certainly wouldn't want a man like this one as her gladiator. And from nowhere we've heard about the mysterious man that has proven to be a brilliant fighter many times before, the Blue Wolf. The Blue Wolf lifted a fist in the air, but not in a very passionate manner. He probably had been ordered to make a few moves to rouse the crowd even when he couldn't care less about what people thought of him. Regardless, the multitude cheered him on eagerly. "Gee, I think we picked the right guy, Angela," said Ty Lee while the man on the scaffold kept rambling about both the contestants' skills. "He's so cute." "How can you say he's cute if you can't even see his face?" asked Mai, rolling her eyes. "Just look at that build, Mai," said Ty Lee, blushing as she stared at the Blue Wolf's features, mesmerized. "No matter if you're married, you'd have to be dead if looking at him doesn't produce at least a little fascination in you. He's so great looking." Angela heard Ty Lee's words and wondered why the girl was so smitten over the Blue Wolf. Granted, his muscles were well defined and his slender but strong figure seemed far better preserved than what Angela would have expected to see on an amateur gladiator, but that didn't mean he was strikingly handsome. Well, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, it hardly mattered. He was bound to be a simple-minded brute beneath whatever looks he was concealing behind his helmet. Angela decided to reserve her judgment of him until after she had witnessed his fighting skills. But will the Blue Wolf's long-standing winning streak last? Or will the Dart Slayer send him to the next life today? Said the man on the scaffold. "We'll find out right away. Let the battle begin." And with another roar of the crowd, he dropped back on his seat, the highest one in the stands. Angela figured he was the owner of the arena, judging both by the seat he took and his attitude, but she decided to focus on the two combatants now, since the fight had finally started. The Blue Wolf hadn't unsheathed the weapons that hung on his belt and back, whereas the Dart Slayer already had his scimitar in hand, circling his rival while showing him a smirk of yellow teeth. In a quick movement, the Dart Slayer slid his hand into a pouch that hung on his belt and he tossed something towards the Blue Wolf, something small and sharp, not easy to see with the naked eye, but for what they knew about this fighter, it couldn't have been anything other than his fabled darts. The Blue Wolf jumped out of the way and knocked a few darts over with a club that had been on his back. He swung it with such speed that most the crowd stared in disbelief. Angela's eyes studied his movements quickly as she began thinking Ty Lee's statement had been right. She really had selected the superior fighter. He was swift and effective with his every move, not overdoing anything as he calculated the situation quickly, trying to figure out how his opponent would attack next, where he should strike back. The Blue Wolf kept avoiding the darts for a while until the Dart Slayer seemed to grow irritated to see his attacks were fruitless. With his scimitar in hand, he ran towards his opponent, who took another weapon from his back and parried his rival's attack with it. Angela frowned when she saw what the Blue Wolf was using to fight now. Maybe she was seeing things, but it sure looked like the blue boomerang she had seen a long time ago in the hands of that reckless water tribe warrior. Could it be him? No, it was ridiculous. That boy was a foolish fighter. He had definitely not been skilled enough to survive for 2 years of battling against the wildest slaves. She couldn't recognize that boy's fighting style on the Blue Wolf anyway. It was likely his weapons had been given to a man who decided to use them after he had been slain on his first battle or something. It was a more logical conclusion than to think he was the same man she had met down south. But if this was Sokka of the Water Tribe? Her heart skipped a beat at the thought. She gulped as she tried to keep her sudden emotions at bay. It couldn't be him, it simply couldn't. She shook her head, feeling like a fool by letting her thoughts bother her. It didn't mean anything if this man was the same one she had met all those years ago. It wasn't as if she was going to select precisely him as her gladiator, was she? But wasn't she? As she saw him struggle against the Dart Slayer, she realized his fighting style appealed to her far more than it should. It didn't help that Ty Lee's crazy ideas about the man being handsome were starting to slip into her head as she saw how his muscles tensed with every movement he made. Part of his chest was in plain sight, His armor didn't cover him completely, and the glistening sweat that ran down his skin made her mouth run dry all of a sudden. She had to shake her head to return to reality, wondering what on earth was taking over her. But her attention was quickly drawn back by the fight itself when the Dart Slayer, after his blade clashed against the Blue Wolf's boomerang several times, withdrew a dart sneakily from his pouch and stuck it into the Blue Wolf's shoulder. The Blue Wolf jumped backwards after pushing his opponent away forcibly with one hand. The Dart Slayer fell to the ground and jumped up while the Blue Wolf walked as far as he could from his rival, his left arm growing numb instantly. Were the darts coated with some kind of poison? The Blue Wolf didn't know, but he decided he wouldn't take any chances. He removed the needle from his arm and some blood trickled down his arm. Judging by the fact that he couldn't see any liquids that proved his wound was infected with anything dangerous, he assumed he would be safe to continue fighting despite how numb his arm felt. He would have to make do with only his right arm for now. The Dart Slayer continued tossing projectiles at the Blue Wolf now that his opponent had been weakened, but to his dismay, the Blue Wolf kept avoiding and knocking darts over with his club. The Blue Wolf's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation quickly, or at least, Angela guessed that was what he was doing. The darts were deadly, he would need to force his enemy to fight only with his sword, so he would have to keep distance between himself and his opponent in order to force him to attack with darts until he ran out of needles. Another possible course of action would be to distract him with the boomerang and jump at him with the club when the Dart Slayer wasn't expecting an attack, well, that is, if the Blue Wolf was smart enough to think things through while catching his breath. And to her surprise, it seemed he was smart enough indeed. Angela stared at him in awe as he tossed his boomerang at the Dart Slayer, who hadn't foreseen the attack, and he had to duck to avoid the blow. While he did so, the Blue Wolf detached something from his belt and rolled it on the floor in the direction of the Dart Slayer, who stumbled to regain his stance. And when he did, he found there was a small gray sphere between his feet. He realized what was going to happen far too late to avoid it. The sphere began spinning on its own accord as it released black smoke on the section of the pit where the Dart Slayer stood. The Blue Wolf smirked as he grasped his club, waiting. He was simply listening to the Dart Slayer's whimpers as he tried to find his way within the cloud of smoke. He moved towards where he heard the Dart Slayer's footsteps. Just waiting, and trying not to think things through. If he tried to reason with what he was doing, he would lose his center yet again, and he couldn't let that happen. He took a deep breath and grasped his club with a powerful grip as the Dart Slayer's figure finally began to take shape within the smoke. The Dart Slayer stumbled and tripped as he finally managed to slip out of the smoke, but before he could make any sense of his bearings, a powerful strike hit his legs, knocking him over to the ground. His bones had just been crushed by the Blue Wolf's club, who had attacked his rival the very second he had left the smoke cloud. He repeated his blows, blood splattering all over the place as the Dart Slayer cried out loud in agony, realizing he had lost the battle even though he wasn't dead yet. He soon would be, at this rate. The Blue Wolf stepped away from the shuddering figure in the ground, panting as he did his best to empty his mind before delivering the final blow. He tried his best not to assimilate what he had done when he felt the man's skull shattering under the power of his club. The crowd roared with joy as the Dart Slayer became nothing but a memory, another corpse lying under the scorching midday sun. Ty Lee had jumped into Mai's arms, hiding her face in the girl's shoulder as to avoid watching the gruesome scene, unwilling to be a witness of such an atrocious act. Mai herself had shut her eyes firmly, disgusted by the pointless violence. But Angela, despite not feeling too comfortable by watching how a man killed another by breaking his head, was in too big a shock to care. The smoke bomb, the boomerang, the club, and the man from the counter had said this particular fighter had survived for 2 years straight. Maybe she was jumping to conclusions, it might not be him anyway. All trace of doubts vanished when the Blue Wolf took off his helmet and waved at the crowd unenthusiastically, his features now in plain sight. She didn't need to see the scars in his neck, the ones she had put there herself, she didn't need to pay attention to his warrior's wolf tail. All she had needed to see to confirm her doubts were his deep blue eyes, which glistened brightly under the sun. When he turned to wave towards the zone where she sat, she felt time stopping as she came to a realization. This man, the only man who had ever acknowledged her as equals despite her being a woman, this man was a gladiator. She had come looking to sponsor somebody, and he had proven he had talents and expertise worthy of a professional gladiator. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at his features, wondering if he had been this attractive back when they'd met at the South Pole. The man jumped on the scaffold again and kept rousing the crowd while praising the Blue Wolf's skills non-stop, as if he hadn't doubted he would survive back when the battle hadn't even begun. But Angela was too busy staring at the surviving warrior to care about the man's words. When the smoke finally cleared up, a few slaves showed up to remove the Dart Slayer's corpse from the grounds, and the Blue Wolf walked away, exiting the premises of the sand pit through the same door through which he had entered it in the first place. "Is it over?" asked Ty Lee, tears streaming down her face as she pulled away from her friend's arms. "Yeah," said Mai, feeling a lump on her throat after the horror she had witnessed. "Angela, please, let's leave," begged Ty Lee, turning to the princess and tugging on her sleeve. "I can't watch another of these awful fights, I really can't. Please don't do this, it's too dreadful." "Don't worry," muttered Angela sternly, surprising both Ty Lee and Mai. "We don't need to watch the next fight." "What? Why?" asked Mai. "Please tell me you're saying this because you've decided you won't be part of something so gruesome." "It is sickening," admitted Angela. "But no, I haven't given up on my ploy, not in the slightest." "Are you saying?" asked Ty Lee, staring at her in horror. "Are you saying you'll take that guy as your gladiator?" "Yes," said Angela, uttering that sole syllable with enough determination to silence both her friends. She stood up then, and Ty Lee and Mai were glad to follow her and leave the stands of the horrible gladiator arena. Still, both of them were eyeing Angela with concern. Was she really going to hire such a deadly and heartless man to become her gladiator? Ty Lee no longer seemed to care about how great his looks were, aghast as she was after observing how he had destroyed his opponent's legs with such ease. She had already hidden on Mai's shoulder before he delivered the final blow. She didn't have to watch the end of the fight to be completely appalled by how ruthless he had been. He was truly terrifying, but so was Angela, truth to be told. They probably made a better pair than it seemed at first thought. When they reached the vestibule, the man at the counter jumped at the sight and threw himself on the floor, bowing down to Angela. "I apologize for my behavior, princess," he squealed, and Angela stared at him in disgust. "What's the matter with you?" she asked. "Get up, this is ridiculous." "Hey, where's my money?" Mai asked the man, folding her arms. "The Blue Wolf won. Pay up." "Oh. Oh. Right away," yelled the man, running behind the counter and pulling out far more coins than he needed to. "I'm very sorry for any inconveniences, I can't believe I was stupid enough to make you pay. I'm a disgrace." "You probably are," said Angela, as she watched Mai collect the money they owed her. "But you can still be a little useful, despite how pathetic you are. Who should I talk to if I want to sponsor a gladiator?" The man behind the counter put away the extra coins he had put out, and he stared at Angela in awe as he processed her words. "Well," he mumbled, building up a reply. "I guess you should go up to Huangli, he's the one in charge of the whole thing, but he's going to be busy for a while with the next fights. Once all the battles are done, you'll be able to find him in the gladiator barracks. They're right behind the arena, you can access them through an alley that runs right next to this very building." "So we have to wait?" asked Angela, irritated. "How many fights are there left?" "2, I believe," muttered the man. "Hopefully they'll be over quickly." "They'd better be," grumbled Angela. "We'll wait here until they're done." Mai and Ty Lee nodded and the three of them sat on a bench at one side of the vestibule. They didn't talk much, for both Mai and Ty Lee were too troubled after what they had witnessed, and Angela was wondering what exactly she would do once she faced the gladiator again. This reencounter wasn't bound to go smoothly, she didn't expect it to, but she needed him. She would grant the gladiator whatever he wished for as long as he helped her fulfill her goals. After an hour or so, people began leaving the arena, the matches were over. Angela stood up and gestured at her friends to follow her, which they did without a second thought, hoping to see this matter end as quickly as possible. They left the arena and walked down the alley the man from the counter had mentioned. Angela wasn't surprised to see the man from the scaffold chuckling and laughing as he counted the coins in his bag. He was the one in charge of this business, no doubt about it. "Excuse me," said Angela, announcing herself. I need to speak to Huang Li. I'm Huang Li, said the man, still too busy with his money to look at who he was talking to. What do I want, wench? Ma Li stared at the man in shock, unable to believe the man had dared insult Angela in this manner. The princess, though, did nothing other than smirk. This man most definitely knew not of what he had asked for, and he was about to find out, painfully. Care to say that again, useless scum? She muttered, her serene voice concealing her anger. Huang Li finally looked up when she insulted him. Nobody insulted him and got away with it, was what he had planned to say until he saw the three elegant ladies in front of him. The one who was glaring at him menacingly was wearing a golden hairpiece. To boot, he was done for, he knew it. Huang Li couldn't do anything but squeal in horror as Angela grabbed him by the neck of his shirt and pinned him against a wall fiercely. It didn't matter that he was at least 4 inches taller than her and much heavier, she had more than the necessary strength to deal with him. Both Ma and Li, despite having been so shaken by Gladiator fight, actually hoped Angela would beat the man to a pulp. They weren't as resentful towards the misogynist society they lived in as the princess was, but there was a limit as to how much rubbish they were willing to put up with by stupid men like Huang Li. Angela held the man in place with her right hand and coated her left with her blue fire, just so that Huang Li would understand the extent of his crime if he hadn't realized already who he was dealing with. I, he said, panting. I'm so sorry, Your Highness. I didn't notice it was you. I should hope so, muttered Angela. Regardless, I recommend you begin thinking before opening that foul mouth of yours from now on. Although I doubt you can do such a thing, you mustn't even have a brain within that thick skull, although, is it really that thick? Well, I'll find out if it is soon enough. As she asked the last question she raised her free hand towards his temple, and Huang Li began panting uncontrollably, fearing for his life. I'm so sorry, Your Highness. He yelled. I didn't mean to. I beg you, don't kill me. Angela didn't feel like sparing his life, to be honest, but she knew both Ma and Li had seen enough violence in one day to also witness how she slaughtered a man in the middle of an alley. She didn't recoil, but she decided to get what she was looking for before giving the man the punishment he deserved. I won't, if you help me with something, she muttered. Can you do that? Anything. I swear, I'll do anything. He squealed desperately, making her wince. He was truly disgusting. Good, muttered Angela. I want to speak to the Blue Wolf in private. Where can I find him? Oh, the Blue Wolf? Asked Huang Li. He's in here, but the barracks, they're no place for a princess such as yourself. What are you trying to say, Huang Li? Asked Angela, bringing her fire dangerously close to his face. I mean, I can set up a meeting between you both. He squealed, terrified. I will. But not here. This is no place for a princess. There's an inn across the street, and my brother owns it. I'll send the Blue Wolf there, to room 24. Wait there, I'll have him meet you there right away. Angela frowned, the fire on her hand still dancing hazardously. Huang Li's eyes were almost overflowing with tears by now, as he believed he would lose his life to her left hand, and his fear of death caused him to scream when her right hand began burning the cloth she was gripping firmly. Once she burned the fabric she was holding, Huang Li collapsed on the ground while smacking his chest, trying to smother the flames that still burned his clothes and his body hair. Make sure you set this up, then, Angela said. I will be waiting. Room 24, you said? If your gladiator isn't there in 10 minutes, I'll be burning more than just your shirt next time. Am I clear? See crystal clear, Your Highness. Squeaked Huang Li, bowing even though he was still patting his chest. Angela looked down on him, feeling compelled to deliver another strike at him, but she held back. If he didn't send Sokka to her on time, she would make him pay for it afterwards, when Ma and Li weren't watching. Let's go, ladies, she said, walking down the alley once more, headed towards the inn Huang Li had mentioned. Ma and Li followed her, but not before glaring at the man that still lay on the ground, panting as he tried to catch his breath. Huang Li's legs still trembled when he entered the barracks in order to find the Blue Wolf, Dumarang, Sokka of the Water Tribe. He found him washing his clothes after having taken a bath himself, a ritual he performed every time he was done with his combats for the day. Huang Li tapped the young man on the right shoulder, surprising him. What's the matter? Asked Sokka, clearing his throat. He hadn't spoken in what felt like ages, but seeing Huang Li looking this troubled was too unusual not to comment on. Something strange must have happened to him, judging by the look on his face and his scorched shirt. "Dumb. Blue Wolf," he said, avoiding using his ridiculous nickname for Sokka. Someone wants to talk to you. You must meet her in the inn across the arena, room 24. Go, or else she'll kill us both." "She?" asked Sokka, standing up as he frowned. "Who is this she, exactly?" "She. I was a fool," said Huang Li, shaking his head. "I called her, how could I call her wench? I'm the worst, I'll pay for this, and I'm sure I will. I don't know why she spared my life, but she threatened me with that blue fire." Sokka's eyes opened wide, and he dropped the cloth he had been cleansing. A dangerous woman with blue fire who had let Huang Li live for reasons unknown after he had insulted her, it couldn't be, could it? Wait, why?" he asked, frowning. "Didn't you ask her why she wanted to talk to me?" "How could I have questioned her?" cried Huang Li. "She's so beautiful and terrible. I had nothing to say to the Fire Lord's daughter. All she wanted was to see you, and that's all I can do. If I'm lucky, maybe she won't kill me when she's through with you." Sokka wanted to keep questioning the man in front of him, but he decided against it immediately. His worst enemy, the woman he kept thinking about, the woman he wanted to kill, had requested his presence. A smile formed on his features as he realized his hopes to take revenge on her might actually come true now. He took some spare clothes from the pile of objects that belonged to him and he clad himself with them, buckling up, weapons included, to meet Princess Azula of the Fire Nation. For 2 years he had waited for the chance to cross paths with her again, and now she had sought him out herself. Maybe this was his lucky day after all. Chapter 5, Introduction 5. Sokka breathed deeply as he walked down the alley, heading towards the inn Huang Li had indicated him to go to. After talking to him, the amateur arena's owner had scurried off to make sure his brother would be aware of the important meeting that would be taking place in room 24. Huang Li didn't actually know what business Azula had in mind, but whenever a nobleman took interest in any of his men he would have them meet on room 24. His brother was already used to these developments, so he was bound to lend him the room without complaint. Sokka wondered if guards of some sort would take his weapons from him before he even got to see the darned girl. It was likely to happen, but if it didn't, he would be ready to fight her, that is, if she had come to give him the rematch he had been waiting for. He carried his boomerang, his club, and a knife he hardly recurred to, but he knew those weapons alone wouldn't be enough to overpower the princess if things came to violence between them, just as he hoped they would. But the wound on his arm weakened him, despite the dart didn't have any poisonous substances on its tip. The projectile probably had punctured a muscle or something, which brought forth an irritating pain that would keep him from fighting to the best of his skill. He crossed the street and glared at the high-class carriage that stood next to the walkway. If he had any doubts left about the princess being here, they were dispelled immediately upon the sight of the vehicle. Nobody in Huiyi owned anything of such value, the carriage was so out of place it was irritating. Sokka decided to forget about the carriage for now, though, and he turned to face the inn. Room 24, was it? He took a deep breath and pushed the building's front door inwards, walking inside without looking at anyone in the crowded vestibule or bothering to ask for directions, since they weren't really necessary. He reached the stairs and continued upwards, ignoring the 2 girls that stood next to the stairway. The 2 of them watched him carefully, one of them apparently studious, the other one blushing slightly, but Sokka was so focused on the person he'd have to face in room 24 that he failed to notice them. Ty Lee couldn't help herself to gape after the gladiator as he climbed the steps to the upper floor. "What are you doing?" asked Mai, frowning disapprovingly. "I know we just watched him do something really horrible," muttered Ty Lee, blushing even more. "But damn, he's hot." Mai groaned in annoyance and shook her head, amazed by Ty Lee's knack for allowing her hormones take full reign. "You're unbelievable," she said, as Ty Lee stared on at the now empty stairway, waiting for the handsome young man to reappear. Sokka was unaware of how the girl by the stairs was swooning over him, though. He looked for room 24 and found it on the top floor of the inn. He read the number over and over again, feeling his blood boil. What would happen when he entered that room? What would he say? What would she say? Would she try to kill him as soon as she saw him? Or would he be the one taken over by the urge to slay her? Well, he would find out sooner than later. He extended his trembling hand towards the doorknob, his insides twisting wildly as he thought of every possible outcome to this crazy endeavor. The door creaked loudly as he opened it and entered the room. He tried to keep steady as he saw her standing by the window, her back towards him. Her long black hair ran down her back, a small knot stood on the top of her head, held together by a red lace and crowned by the same royal hairpiece she had worn back when they had first met down at the South Pole. Sokka hated to find his eyes studying her, hated to acknowledge she was still as beautiful as ever even though he hadn't even seen her face yet, but surely, she was still as deadly as ever as well. As he stared at her, he wondered if she felt half as nervous as he did about this encounter. Probably not. It wasn't as if his face haunted her nightmares, as if she considered him the one to blame for all what was wrong in her life. But he was wrong. The second she heard the door open, her heart had jumped in her chest. Why was it so exhilarating to meet the Water Tribe warrior again? She couldn't let emotions sway her only because he was the sole man to ever show her respect without her forcing it out of him. The fact that she had found him attractive while he was in the gladiator pit didn't help either, it probably made the situation far worse. What would happen now? What should she say? Would he agree to be her gladiator? She deeply hoped he would. After a few seconds, she finally calmed her nerves enough and turned slowly to face him. Sokka didn't know if to feel glad or disappointed to finally catch a glimpse of her face. He had half hoped she would be covered in pimples so that he could stop finding her so mesmerizing, but of course, he wouldn't be so lucky. Her skin was as flawless as ever. Her amber eyes clashed with his azure gaze once again after 2 years. They had only met once before, but somehow they had been expecting this reunion so badly that it didn't feel like they were almost total strangers. Both stood holding the other's stare, both wondering who would say the first words, who would make the first move. "It's been a while," muttered Azula, unable to resist the silence anymore. Sokka didn't reply, unsure of what to say. Anything he dared utter could have catastrophic consequences. "I'll assume you agree to that statement," she muttered carelessly, growing a little impatient. If he wasn't going to talk, he would make this far easier for her, and naturally, as soon as this thought scrolled through her mind, he finally decided to talk. "I don't, actually," he grunted, his voice surprising Azula. Had his tone grown hoarse after these years? She could recall he had almost been squeaky-voiced before. The time he had spent among amateur gladiators had changed him in more ways than she had noticed. "It's not as if I hadn't seen you at all during these 2 years. What is that supposed to mean?" asked Azula, raising an eyebrow. "You wouldn't understand, I guess," said Sokka, folding his arms. "I'm pretty sure you can't even imagine what it's like to have your life, your home, and everything you love taken away by an overpowered and arrogant princess who doesn't give a damn about what she's doing, because all she cares about is taking over the world." Azula couldn't help but feel slightly offended at his words, but she knew he was partially right nevertheless. "Why do I have the feeling that you've spent ages planning what you would say at this very moment?" she asked, trying not to show any weakness whatsoever. "Maybe because I was," growled Sokka. "You're unbelievable, after what you've done to me, after all you stole from me, you have the guts to show your face in front of me as if what you've done meant nothing. As if you had the right to simply walk into my life and do as you please. What did you come here for, to make sure I've been suffering just as you wanted me to? Well, congratulations. You fulfilled your goal. You've turned me into a disgusting monster. You've made me hate myself and hate everything I have to do to survive, and I simply did it because I kept fueling my rage towards you, hoping the day for payback would come soon." Azula hadn't been expecting a sweet reunion of any sort, but she didn't expect the man to pour out his soul to her in this manner either. She stared skeptically as he spoke, wondering if he would actually dare attack her. "And you're planning to take your revenge right here and now?" she asked, playing with a lock of her hair. "Is that it?" "And no, muttered Sokka, lowering his eyes and even surprising himself with his words. I've spilled enough blood today. So I'll be on your waiting list, then, she asked, smirking. You having fun? Asked Sokka, gritting his teeth. You know, at times I've had to fight against 6 guys in a row, and I had to kill them all. I can kill you too, no problem at all. Your memory must have grown faint if you truly think so, muttered Azula. I watched you battle that odd dart man today, and despite you're far more capable a fighter than you used to be, you're still no match for me. Wanna bet? He asked, lifting his hand towards his boomerang. Azula lifted her own hand, but to Sokka's surprise, she was showing him her palm, asking him to stop what he was about to do. He glared at her, unable to understand what she was thinking. Despite what you may think, I didn't come all this way so that we could fight each other again, she said. I have better things to do than to seek out slaves that might hold grudges against me. Sokka was taken aback completely by her words, but he didn't lower his hand yet. For all he knew, she might be lying. Then what are you here for? He asked. Azula folded her arms as she sought the proper words, in hopes he wouldn't reply to her in anger, although she was expecting him to have a hysterical outburst towards her at some point. But she'd have to endure it. She needed him, and it was rather convenient for him that she did. She only had to make him understand that. A few developments in my life have been considerably unkind to me as of late. She began, but Sokka let out a bark of skeptical laughter, making her stop on her tracks. She had chosen the wrong words, hadn't she? What's so funny? Excuse me if I find your sad story to be nigh unbelievable, he said, his eyes ablaze with scorn. I doubt I'll be able to relate to your pain, seeing as you probably suffer because your dad didn't buy you the baby dragon you asked him for or something. Azula narrowed her eyes, his mocking attitude bothering her. But despite the way he was speaking to her, she couldn't trash him with her words outright. She had to endure everything he threw at her, she had no other choice if she wanted him to join her. I don't have petty issues like those, although it hardly surprises me that you'd believe those are the problems I'm enduring, she said. Commoners aren't able to understand the plights of the highborn. Sokka shook his head as he stared at her in disbelief, his arms folded. You've got guts to talk about how miserable you are, he snarled. You really don't see how ridiculous it is for you to whine about how troublesome your life is, do you? How hard must the Fire Lord's daughter have it? Oh, how difficult her life must be while she gets pampered by servants for 24 hours a day. You really have some nerve to come here to say you've suffered a lot. Do you have any idea of what I've been through? I've had to make a living by killing men, and by dying slowly in the process. I can't even look at myself in a mirror anymore. I don't recognize the sound of my voice. It takes every ounce of my willpower for me not to take my own life after the horrors I've seen, and the awful things I've had to do with my own hands. You think your life is hard? Think again, princess. There are some things in this world you'll never have to face, some things you'll never understand because you live within your bubble of royal pains. Don't you dare come to me whining about how hard you're having it, it's so ridiculous it's revolting. Azula's eyes were fixed upon Sokka, the expression on them completely inexpugnable. Sokka could tell she was thinking about something, but he couldn't read her thoughts at all. I have to say, you're wrong to believe being pampered 24 hours a day is fun, she muttered, making him stumble in surprise. The hell? Is that all you got from what I just said to you? He yelled, staring at her in utter disbelief. I wasn't done yet, she muttered, though he couldn't help but glare at her in distrust. When, exactly, did I say my troubles were worse than what you've been facing for 2 years? I don't think I ever claimed as much. On the other hand, yes, you don't really understand what problems I'm faced with. Certainly, I'm not working as a slave or a gladiator, but it doesn't mean I don't have my own issues I must resolve. Well, it's really nice of you to clear that up, said Sokka. But turns out I really don't give a damn about whatever is troubling you. Because, hey, turns out the source of the misery I've been forced to face during these years is you. There's no one else to blame but you, princess, and I hate you for it. You've made me what I am now. And I hate myself even more than I loathe you. So, was his new muscular build her fault too? Well, she didn't mind taking the blame for that, though she kept her opinion to herself this time. Letting him know he was physically attractive to her would probably unleash an array of trouble she preferred to avoid. "Nobody said you had to like me," she muttered, and Sokka glared at her again. "Yeah, no one said that," he said with gritted teeth. "But I'm thinking we got sidetracked here anyways. What is it that you want from me?" "I think you're smart enough to figure that out for yourself," said Azula, her hands on her hips. "Why do you think someone from high society would be seeking out an amateur gladiator?" Sokka frowned and took a few steps back as his mind processed the information. He began shaking his head in utter disbelief as he looked at the woman in front of him, wondering if she was simply insane. "No way," he finally said, making her raise an eyebrow. "And no way. This is absurd. It makes no sense at all." "Oh, so you're refusing to believe what I'm offering you? It's not as if you were saying no to being sponsored by me, right?" "You're crazy," yelled Sokka, still shaking his head. "The hell is wrong with you? What makes you think I would become your gladiator? Why on earth would I accept a proposal like that?" "Why wouldn't you, though?" asked Azula, pressing her back against the wall as she studied the gladiator in front of her. "You have the guts to ask me why?" bellowed Sokka. "Didn't I just say you're the one I blame for my every misfortune? Didn't I make it clear that I hate you?" "Oh, you did, but I also told you it's not as if you needed to like me," said Azula, shrugging. "Sponsors and gladiators aren't meant to be friends, they're just with each other out of convenience. And it works wonders that way." "Well, excuse me if I'm being brutally honest with you," he muttered, his voice shriller now due to his anger. "But I'd rather you burn me alive right here and now than work for you." "Such an extremist," said Azula, with a dramatic sigh. "So, I'm guessing you'd rather be under the orders of that pig, Huangli, for the rest of your life, which won't be as long as you hope if a gladiator smarter than you shows up in Huiyi. For all you know, you might die tomorrow, and you say that's more convenient than becoming a sponsored gladiator." Sokka stood quiet for a second, pondering her words. She certainly posed a complicated conundrum now, though not enough of one that he would feel compelled to accept her proposal, at least, not yet. "And what's the big difference if I become your gladiator?" he asked. "I might die over there as well." "The Superior Gladiator League isn't as heartless as the amateur one," replied Azula. "You would have far more benefits than you can imagine." "Oh, really?" asked Sokka, raising an eyebrow. "Such as?" "For one, I really don't care about the money," said Azula. "I wouldn't have a problem giving you about half the winnings we get on each fight. You probably won't be at risk of getting killed, at least, not most of the time, since the outcomes of these fights aren't decided over death." Sokka narrowed his eyes. That did sound far better than what he had to deal with on a daily basis at Huiyi's arena. "I'll ensure you are trained in combat by the best warriors of the Fire Nation," she said. "I'll be financing anything you need, armors, weapons, food, clothes. You name it, you'll get it. It's among the perks of being a royal, anything I ask I can achieve with ease. So, does that sound at least a little more appealing than what you've been dealing with so far?" Sokka frowned and dropped his gaze, thoughtful. Indeed, those options were extremely tempting, but the one offering them to him was Princess Azula of the Fire Nation. He wouldn't even trust her to light up a candle with fire bending, she was bound to burn the world down just to prove her prowess. How could he trust her? Why should he trust her? Because she might be his one-way ticket back home. "I won't deny it sounds pretty good," muttered Sokka. "But that's not enough for me to sign on. I guess you could say I just don't trust you." Azula's face grew stern with those words. Who said he had to trust her? This savage knew nothing of the world he lived in, did he? "I can see you don't," she muttered. "What will it take for you to trust me, then, if that's what you need in order to accept my proposition?" "Oh, no, don't fool yourself. I doubt I'll ever trust you," he said. "But there's something I want to know before actually considering what you're offering." "What is it, pray tell?" asked Azula, disdainful. What happened to my tribe?" he asked, his voice shaking. Angela was a little surprised to hear that question, but it only made sense for him to ask about his people at some point. It wasn't very likely that he'd hear news about the war in Huiyi, of all places. Truth to be told, I don't know much about it, she admitted. I didn't return to the South Pole after bringing you all the way to Huiyi, so I wasn't involved in those battles directly. But according to what I've heard, your people are still standing strong and fighting against the Fire Nation battalion that was sent to take over the pole. Sokka's eyes grew wide. Angela could see hope in his blue irises. Then, they're still there? They weren't vanquished or anything. If they had been, you might have heard some rumors, don't you think? She asked. I did think so sometimes, he muttered. But I guessed maybe you guys thought so little of my tribe that you didn't even bother bragging about it. I also thought you might have killed everyone and that's why there wasn't any other water tribe slave besides myself. From what I know, matters at both poles are still ongoing, she muttered. The war at the North Pole grows fiercer every passing day, since the waterbenders aren't easy to defeat when they're in favorable environment for them. And according to some rumors I heard, there seems to be a waterbender down at the Southern Water Tribe as well. It seems he's leading the warriors now, or so said the rumors. Sokka's eyes widened even more. It was good to hear his friends and family were still alive, but that waterbender leading the warriors couldn't be anyone other than Katara. Is something wrong? Asked Angela, reading his expression. And no, well, yes. There's still something else I want to know, he muttered. You didn't send anyone after the rest of the warriors once you caught me, did you? After the ones that fled? No, I saw no point in doing that, she muttered. I thought that you were their leader. By taking you out, they would be in disarray, unsure of what to do, unable to organize themselves. It was like killing a beast by its head, if you know what I mean. But as it turns out, the beast suddenly burst out another head, so my efforts were seemingly in vain. You don't need to worry so much about your friends, I didn't hunt them down after catching you. But I don't have any accurate knowledge about what has happened down at the South Pole ever since. I can look it up, though, if you're really that desperate to know. Sokka nodded, his heart leaping with joy. He still loathed her, but she had given him the best news he could have asked for. Is this all you needed to know before joining me? She asked, folding her arms. It's what I needed to know, muttered Sokka. But I still have 2 more conditions. 2 more? Asked Angela, irritated. Exactly how whiny can you get? Do you realize what great honor you're being presented with? I'm even negotiating with you and you still ask for more? If you want me to be your gladiator as badly as it seems, then yes, he said. You can go find someone else if you want, but if you want me, then you've got to deal with my conditions. Angela felt like striking the man in front of her with a bolt of lightning. How dared he act so high and mighty? He was just a pathetic gladiator. And she was the princess of the Fire Nation. How dared he? But then she remembered she truly needed him. She wasn't bound to find another gladiator to her liking, even though she didn't like this one as much as she could have. He complained too much. Still, she sighed and muttered. What are those conditions, then? Sokka was surprised to hear her comply. He didn't expect Angela to be so keen to have him as her gladiator. She could have anyone else. Why him? Why go along with anything he asked for? It was suspicious, extremely suspicious. Well, first of all, I want to take 75% of the winnings, not half and half. Done, said Angela. I don't care about the money, I already said that. Right, muttered Sokka. The last one is, once I achieve whatever goal you have in mind to accomplish with me, you'll let me return to the Southern Water Tribe. Angela stared at him, aghast. What? She said, in such tone that Sokka could tell her patience was in shambles by now. You don't think I want to stay a slave forever, do you? You don't think I care for your wishes, do you? She asked mockingly. Just how much more do you plan to patronize me? Just a little more, don't sweat it, he replied, a feisty smile on his face. I refuse to agree to that, grunted the princess. It's ridiculous. I have no reason to go along with any of what you've asked of me. I thought so too, muttered Sokka. Yet you seemed oddly keen to put up with everything I've said. Why? What makes you so desperate to have a gladiator? Why are you so intent on having that gladiator be me? I have my reasons, replied Azula, lowering her gaze. Sokka frowned. Oh, really, now? What are those reasons, then? They're none of your business, grunted Azula. Sokka let out another bark of laughter as he stared at her in utter disbelief. And you still want me to just accept without questioning you at all? Indeed, muttered Azula. I've given you enough quarter already for you to keep on demanding more from me. I'm sorry, but I can't do that. As I said, I don't trust you at all, and I'm not signing up on this crazy scheme if I'm not sure I'll survive. What do you mean you're not sure you'll survive? Repeated Azula, getting more annoyed by the minute. Why did this man have to be so difficult? You're refusing to tell me whatever you want to achieve with this, he said. You keep avoiding saying why you need me. I don't want to get into this mess if I don't know what your goal is, because, for all I know, you might just be using me for entertainment. Your life might have become extremely boring lately and you're looking for any form of fun, and to watch me wither and die out in the Superior Gladiator League might just be the most enjoyable idea you've come up with in a long time. That's stupid, said Azula. If I wanted to see you die, I would kill you myself. Believe me, I would enjoy it far more that way. Yeah, well, turns out you Fire Nation people are famous for being insane sadists. The more you play around with me, the more fun you'll have when you destroy me. Oh, you're such a fool, she said, shaking her head in disapproval. Do you really think that if I simply wanted to have fun, I wouldn't be able to find something far more interesting than this? Gladiator battles aren't really that appealing to me. I have better things to do, and I'd get them done if I didn't need to tend to something right now. And the only way I can tend to it is by getting a gladiator. Well, I don't get it, said Sokka. Nobody said you had to understand anyway, said Azula. The sole thing you're concerned about is that I might want to watch you suffer and die in the ring. Well, it's not going to happen. I want you to live and triumph. Why, though? Asked Sokka. What's the real goal of what you're doing? Just say it already, will you? Azula sighed and lowered her gaze again. I have two objectives, if I think about this in the long run, she muttered. First of all, I need you to defeat someone's gladiator. And I need it done as quickly as possible. You'll have about 1 month to train to be up to the skill of this gladiator, then, you must fight him. And you must win, no matter what. Understood. Okay. Said Sokka, gulping. Who was this person Azula seemed to hold a grudge towards? Why did she need him to smash his gladiator so badly? What about the other goal, then? It's something I realized just now, actually, she said. Truth to be told, if you achieve victory in your first fight, you might be the person I need to help me accomplish the biggest of my feats so far. Right, can you be direct and say what you want already? Asked Sokka, growing impatient. I want you to become the top gladiator of the Superior Gladiator League. Sokka's jaw dropped in quite a comical manner. Azula, though, wasn't amused. Her stare was steady on his eyes, proving to him that she was serious about what she'd just said. Why you're crazy, woman, he said, unable to believe her statement. You really are crazy. That does seem to be the popular belief. She muttered, playing with her fringe as Sokka yanked the short stubs of hair that grew on the sides of his head. You're insane. He concluded, turning to her again. How can you even suggest I become the top gladiator? I'm not even the best in the amateur league of Hui Yi. You're giving up before even trying. Asked Azula, disappointed. Please, cut the crap. Yelled Sokka. You're talking about the Superior League. They have benders there and all. How on earth do you want a simple non-bender like me to beat them? Maybe I'm good against people like me, but against benders I'll be toast. Which is why you'll be trained so you can fight benders on even terms, said Azula. You had a few tricks up your sleeve today against the Dart Man, which is proof you're smart enough to come up with ploys that might give you the upper hand even against the most skilled benders. Also, rules are very different in the Superior Gladiator League, and there are several non-benders amongst their top gladiators. And what makes you think I can be one of them? Asked Sokka, his eye twitching. What makes you think you can't be? Replied Azula. Just imagine the glory you'd attain, the top gladiator, a non-bender. People would be in awe and they would hold you in high honors, no matter if you're a slave or not. That's likely, but still. Mumbled Sokka. I don't know. It sounds fishy. But, if I manage to become the top gladiator, you'll let me return home. Azula's brow contracted as she pondered her options. She would rather have him prove he was worthy of the position of first gladiator of the Superior League during a few weeks or months, but she didn't have much of a choice at this point. It was all or nothing when it came to this slave, apparently. Yes, she said, and Sokka jumped, surprised. I thought you'd refuse, he admitted. Well, I didn't, said Azula. Do we have ourselves a deal, then? Sokka didn't know what he was getting himself into, and he probably didn't want to know either. This was bound to develop into something beyond his control, something absurd that he wouldn't understand, since he didn't understand much about it already anyways. Why did Azula need a gladiator? Why him? What was the point of making him the top gladiator of the Superior League? He wanted the answer to these questions, but he figured he would find out soon enough if he was patient. Deal, he said, extending his hand towards her. Azula stared at the hand, unsure if she should grasp it or not. It was a ridiculous notion, a princess shaking hands with a slave, but he had seen her as equals back when they were at the South Pole. Perhaps she should return the favor now. Both felt a thrill racing through them when their hands touched, no matter if Sokka's was covered by a glove. The most physical touch Sokka had had lately was when he had been forced to strangle a man to his death. Azula didn't happen to touch many people either, and for him to be the one she touched, of all people, but despite the turmoil of feelings within them, their eyes didn't betray them as they held the other's gaze, both facing this new challenge with determination and certainty. An alliance was formed then, one that would last for many years, one that would eventually develop into something beyond their reasoning, because right now, the sole conviction they both held was that they had become sponsor and gladiator. Very well, said Azula, letting go of his hand. Let's head out. There's a lot to do, and not much time to get it done. Wait, what? Asked Sokka. Head out where? You don't expect us to stay in Huiyi, do you? We'll go to the capital and then I'll find a good master for you. You're free to bid farewell to this town if you think you're going to miss it. It dawned upon Sokka that he was actually going to leave Huiyi. Somehow, the thought was so exhilarating that he forgot for a minute all his reserves about Azula being the one to get him out of the dreadful town. He had thought he would die here, but he had been given a chance to a slightly better life. I don't think I'll miss it at all, he said, smiling despite himself. But I can't just head out. I have to get my stuff first. Fine, said Azula, slightly exasperated by now. Go pack quickly, I'll wait for you by the carriage. I won't take long, don't be so cranky, he said. It's not as if I had much to pack anyway. Do you want me to feel sorry for you? Asked Azula, raising an eyebrow. No. Said Sokka. Good. Because it wasn't working anyway, she said. Get a move on, will you? Fine, fine. Said Sokka, glaring at her as he left the room. Sokka sprinted down the stairs, his heart beating wildly. Once or twice he had thought about escaping from the gladiator barracks and head down to his tribe on his own. There were only a handful of guards surrounding the arena and all its adjacent buildings, and he could have overpowered them. Well, probably not. The guards were firebenders, well-fed and rested, while he hardly ate 2 meals a day and was forced to overexert himself with the fights, which weakened him thoroughly. So leaving Huiyi had been nothing but a dream he didn't even want to think about, especially since he believed his fate as a gladiator was well-deserved. But now, Ty Lee couldn't help but stare after Sokka as he ran to the door, straight towards the barracks where his belongings awaited. So, he survived, said Mai. Why wouldn't he have? Asked Ty Lee, surprised. I don't know. I have the feeling there's something odd about Azula and this guy, muttered Mai. She dropped that water tribe slave here 2 years ago, didn't she? And the blue wolf has been here for 2 years. He has tan skin, blue eyes, don't you think it could be the same person? It could be, said Ty Lee, thoughtful. So you think there's some bond between them, right? There could be. I don't know, said Mai, shrugging. I hope not, said Ty Lee, sighing as she thought about the man that had passed her by a few seconds ago. Why? Asked Mai, although she was certain she didn't want to know the answer to the question. Because if there's nothing between them, then maybe I can go after him, said Ty Lee, smiling broadly. You'll never change, will you? Said Mai, rolling her eyes. Don't be so stingy, said Ty Lee. Just look at him. He's so handsome that if Angela wasn't to take him as her gladiator, I'd be the one hiring him. Did you forget so quickly about what you just saw him do to the dart guy? Asked Mai, skeptical. Ty Lee winced and flashed her friend a guilty smile. Well, when you remind me of that he's not so charming anymore, but still. Do you think Angela would mind if I got involved with him? Yes, she would mind very much, said the princess, walking down the stairs and overhearing her friend's conversation. Oh, why you really would? Asked Ty Lee, blushing as she smiled guiltily. I don't want my gladiator distracted by anything, grunted Angela. I want him to focus on his training and his fights, nothing else. If you want a man to fool around with, go find your own. Oh, so you won't lend me yours, no matter what? Said Ty Lee, pouting. It's a bit weird to hear you consider him to be your property or something already. He's getting sponsored by me and he's a slave, therefore, he belongs to me, said Angela matter-of-factly. I have the feeling owning such a good-looking guy might make a mess out of you, though. Muttered Ty Lee. You might be the one to end up distracted, if you know what I mean. Angela stared at her sternly. That's so ridiculous it's not even funny, Ty Lee, she said, heading towards the door. Come on, it's time to leave. You really should hold your tongue once in a while, muttered Mai, and Ty Lee chuckled. You'll see I'm right, you'll see, want to bet on it? She asked. If Angela doesn't get smitten over him, I'll pay up 10,000 yuans, but if she does, you'll be the one paying me. You're becoming a betting addict, you know, said Mai, as they crossed the doors. Angela stood next to the carriage. The driver had dozed off on it and hadn't realized the princess was back. Angela's gaze was fixed upon the alley from where she expected Sokka to come from at any moment now. She hadn't thought it would take too long for him to say his goodbyes to Huangli and the other gladiators, but she had no choice other than to wait for him to show up. But the thing is, muttered Mai to Ty Lee. Even if she were to fall for him, do you think he would be interested in her? It doesn't seem likely, if she's the one who got him to become a slave in the first place. Well, I really don't know if he'll want her or not, shrugged Ty Lee. I just wonder if he'd be interested in me. Mai sighed and shook her head, thinking her friend was definitely crazy in her own way. Just then, Sokka came out from the alley carrying a rugged bag of faded blue color on his back. I hope you said goodbye to Huangli for me, said Angela, smirking cruelly. It's the first time he seemed happy to see me alive, muttered Sokka. What exactly did you do to him? You should be asking what he did to anger me instead, said Angela. Ty Lee cleared her throat and looked at the princess, begging her with her eyes to introduce her to the handsome slave. Angela glared at her and sighed, giving in for once. These two girls are my friends, Mai and Ty Lee, she said, pointing at both of them. Mai, Ty Lee, this is Sokka, was it? His heart lurched when he heard his name for the first time in 2 years. The surprise in his eyes was evident for the three girls, who stared at him in confusion. Did I get the name wrong? Asked Angela. And no. He muttered, it's just. I hadn't been called by my name for a long time. Huangli used to call me Dummerang, my gladiator name was the Blue Wolf. It's been ages since I'd heard my real name. Mai didn't seem to care either way about his words, although Angela actually felt moved, despite herself. She wondered if he was thankful because she had called him by his rightful name. As for Ty Lee, her eyes were quickly filled with tears and she jumped at Sokka, clinging onto his arm while squealing. Oh, you poor thing. Don't worry, we'll make sure your life is much, much better than it used to be. Speak for yourself, Angela snapped, as she opened the carriage's door, waking up the sleeping driver with her action. Come on, let's go. I'll sit down next to you, yelled Ty Lee, still holding on to Sokka's arm. Sokka didn't find her strange fascination with him to be entirely uncomfortable. He was a man and having a girl so interested in him was considerably nice, but she was awfully clingy, something he didn't find too enjoyable. Angela and Mai took their seats at one side of the carriage, both bothered by Ty Lee's behavior, but for her sake, they decided to keep quiet. Ty Lee jumped in afterwards and Sokka followed, dropping his luggage on the carriage floor after closing the door behind him. Angela stared with distaste at the old, filthy bag, which made Sokka smirk. Making her uneasy felt like just a small token of the payback he owed her for the 2 years of suffering she had forced upon him. Say, what's with this necklace of yours? Asked Ty Lee, returning him to reality. Most guys don't wear this sort of thing. Oh, it's something I used to wear back in the Water Tribe, he said, confirming Mai's doubts. He was definitely the very slave Angela had brought to Huiyi. It's pretty common down there. I see, said Ty Lee. You have some weird markings on your neck, though, what's with that? Sokka would have been bothered by the way the girl was detailing him, but the question gave him the possibility to glare at the princess that sat across him. Maybe you can ask her instead, he muttered. Angela smirked at his words. You can't possibly be implying it was that painful. Most men enjoy having a woman's nails on their skin. Angela's insinuation made both Mai and Ty Lee blush, but Sokka didn't think much about the princess's innuendo. I advise you to have a psycho with freakishly long nails clawing at your neck before saying anything like that, he grunted. It took ages for those stupid wounds to heal, and don't get me started on the burn mark on my stomach. I thought you were tough enough to bear such marks with pride, said Angela. Apparently I was wrong. Don't act as if my toughness was to be doubted, he yelled, angrily. Then be a man and quit whining so much, she stated with another smirk, to which Sokka had no answer at the moment. He hoped something useful would come to his mind, but to his dismay, no witty reply came. He was left to glare at Angela, who kept smirking proudly. Ty Lee didn't cling on to Sokka for the rest of the trip and she only asked him a few questions, but they weren't anything personal anymore. She didn't know what the deal was between Angela and her newly appointed gladiator, but she could tell the guy next to her seemed to have a certain connection with the princess. She was better off by not getting in the way of whatever weird relationship this was. Mai thought the question she had asked Ty Lee earlier had answered itself after witnessing the way the slave had ignored Ty Lee and focused solely on arguing with Angela. No man she had ever seen around Ty Lee so far would stop paying attention to her, let alone to bicker with the princess. And Mai was quite intrigued by that, truth to be told. She had the strange feeling that whatever relationship was brewing between Angela and Sokka wouldn't be anything similar to what had been seen between gladiators and sponsors so far. The princess, on the other hand, didn't think much of the current happenings, as she was busy envisioning what her next moves would be. She had her gladiator, but that was just the easiest part of her plan. The difficulties were only about to begin. Check the description for the links to the author.